Out with my rant today from HartmannReport.com. Why would anybody embrace fascism? And, you know, I realize that there have been not historically, but, you know, over the last couple of decades, there have been basically kind of two camps about what's animating the hard right. What's animating the Republican Party? What's animating the GOP's base? And one camp argues that they're just all racists. You know, this is the leftover of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan's Southern strategy, combined with, you know, George Herbert Walker Bush's Willie Horton ad, and then Donald Trump, the Mexican rapists are coming, and asshole countries, and keep out the Muslims with this Muslim ban, and all that stuff is added up to just this massive flow of racism. That said, I remember a time when, you know, I mean, growing up in lower middle class Lansing, where, you know, all the white people that I knew had good jobs. They were working at Fisher Body or General Motors. They were making cars. They were making, you know, good money, $30 an hour, which was a lot back then. They had good benefits. And yeah, they were probably mostly racists, but they weren't voting for racists. They weren't, you know, carrying around Confederate flags. They weren't strapping AR-15s to their chest and strutting around like street gangs, you know, threatening people's lives. What's the difference? What happened? What brought the racists out of the woodwork? And in this article, basically, I lay out this hypothesis, which, you know, I've shared with you in the past, but I think, you know, it's worth revisiting from time to time. That what is, you know, in fact, all over social media, people are asking, why would anybody embrace fascism? I mean, because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about fascism. There's this worldwide movement toward fascism. Rachel Maddow opened her show with it last night on MSNBC, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I watched it on the plane from Salt Lake City here. We had a stopover. And I think it's safety. You know, on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the very bottom, of course, is homeostasis. You need to breathe, you need to drink water, you need to, you know, be able to do bodily functions, basically, maintain your body temperature, stuff like that. But right above that is safety. You know, if you're crossing a street and all of a sudden cars are whizzing by you in both directions, you're not thinking about, you know, what you're going to have for dinner or what you want to do with your career goals or you know, whether you should propose to your new girlfriend or what. I mean, what you're thinking about is, how do I avoid getting hit by a car? And what has happened over the last 40 years as part of the Reagan Revolution and in response to the Powell memo, Lewis Powell's memo, is that there has been this huge right-wing infrastructure built, and I would call it a neo-fascist infrastructure, frankly, because they're all promoting fascism. Not necessarily pure Nazism, but something damn close. And, you know, that includes 1,500 right-wing radio stations, that includes, I mean, if you look at the top podcasts, the top 100 podcasts, like the top 40 of them, at least 2/3 of them are right-wing podcasts. There's enormous money behind these. They promote them like crazy. They on social media, they get promotion. You've also got, you know, the owners and people running many of the social media sites are themselves billionaires and conservatives, and so they're pushing these memes as well. And so now what you have is kind of latent racism that has had a fire lit under it by the destruction of the American middle class. We've gone, and largely the white middle class, although since the 60s there was a growing black middle class and a Hispanic middle class as well. And all have taken a hit. The blacks and Hispanics have been hit harder than the whites, but the whites have been hit hard enough that, you know, the middle class in America has gone from 65% of us when Reagan came into office to 45% of us today. So you've got, you know, that 20% that got screwed, you know, the title of one of my books, The Undeclared War on the Middle Class. And these people who have literally, not literally been screwed if you use the you know, some of the definitions, but I'd say, you know, financially they've been screwed. And, you know, they know it, they're just not sure why. And so you've got this huge media structure around the country that, you know, that kind of started with Limbaugh on radio. It started with Rupert Murdoch, the Australian billionaire, on television. that have a very simple answer for these largely white people who have been financially screwed by 40 years of Reaganism. They're saying, okay, who did this to me? Why does my job pay half of what I paid in 1980? And the answer these people will say is, oh, it's because black people want your job. It's because brown-skinned immigrants want your job. It's because women want your job. And if we could just go back to, pre-1965, when women had to have a man's permission to get a credit card or open a checking account, when women generally could not enter the workforce unless it was a secretary, when black people were relegated to very specific jobs, janitors and things like that, and by and large separated from the rest of society. We had segregated water fountains. We still had segregated schools. If we could just go back to that, society would stabilize itself. This was Russell Kirk's great theory. He wrote a book about this called The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Eliot. And it starts out with Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke was the famous British conservative philosopher, political economist back in the late 1700s, who wrote that, it does me no harm if a man is allowed to engage in a profession as servile as that of hairdresser or candlemaker, but it does society considerable violence if such a man is allowed to vote. I'm slightly paraphrasing, but that's pretty close to the exact quote. And this perspective has been adopted by the Republican Party. And now they've reached the logical end of this. They're actually openly, nakedly, enthusiastically promoting fascism in the United States. And they've got this whole network of right-wing billionaires behind them that are also pushing fascism in this country. And they've also got, all these radio stations and podcasts and everything. Interesting, I believe it was the Brennan Center did this study. It was published last week. I mentioned this briefly on Friday, that some of these right-wing podcasts are 11 times more likely to have lies in them than our left-wing podcasts. 11 times. That's 11,000%, right? Or 1,100% more lies. And, you wonder why people are acting crazy. You wonder why people are so angry. You wonder why people have gone so nuts. Simple answer is they're being lied to. They're being told that they are not safe. Now, they know financially they're not safe, but they're being told that that lack of safety is the result of Democrats, of liberals, of queer people, of black people, and of women. And therefore, they need to go after those people. And thus, we've got all these white guys strutting around with AR-15s strapped across their chests, wearing Confederate flags. Surprise, surprise. What do you think?
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. This is from the introduction. Socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Socialist yearnings are as old as capitalism itself because they are its products. Where and when capitalism's problems and failings have accumulated criticism and critics, socialist voices have arisen. And so it is again now. Any serious discussion of socialism must begin by acknowledging socialism's rich diversity. Whatever particular aspect of socialism we choose to analyze, they need to be located within socialism's complexity. That avoids presenting one's own interpretation as if it were the entirety of socialism. In this book, I focus on the economic aspects of socialism, how it differs from capitalism in broad outlines. I'm more interested in socialist critiques of capitalism and their implications about socialist alternatives than in the particulars of the few early experiments in erecting socialist systems, USSR, People's Republic of China, and so on, that history so far offers. Finally, my own education and work constrain me to concentrate on Western Europe and North America. Some important aspects of socialism are thus not covered or discussed here. Yearnings for better lives, such as socialism proposes, are not new. In slave societies, the slaves hoped and dreamed of lives less hard and less out of their own control. Their yearning aimed to obtain freedom. They sought social change that would preclude any one person being the property of another. In feudal societies, the serfs, free in the sense that no one owned them, yearned for better lives too. Their subordination to lords included heavy labor and other burdens that they wanted lifted. They hoped and dreamed of a society in which they would not be bound to the land, the lord of that land, and the feudal dues of labor and subservience. The serfs mobilized in the 1789 French Revolution to demand liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In effect, the serfs had expanded on what the slaves had called freedom. In the American Revolution against British King George III, the revolutionaries were neither slaves nor serfs. They were mostly self-employed farmers, craftspeople, and merchants subject to a foreign feudal kingdom. They wanted liberty as individuals to pursue their dreams without hindrance from feudalism or monarchism, whether foreign or domestic. They added democracy to the goals advanced by the slaves and serfs before them. The different systems of slavery, feudalism, and small-scale self-employment produced masses of people yearning for better lives. Eventually, each of those systems provoked revolutions. Many people then sought to break away from and go beyond those systems. The French and American revolutions marked key moments in the social transformations of major pre-capitalist systems into capitalist ones. By capitalist system, we mean that particular organization of production in which the basic human relation is employer-employee instead of master-slave, lord-serf, or individual self-employment. The revolutionaries who wanted and built capitalism hoped and believed the transition to employer-employee relations of production would bring with them the liberty, equality, brotherhood, and democracy they had yearned for. The revolution's leaders promised to themselves and to the people they led that those goals would be achieved. But the transition to capitalist employer-employee relations that increasingly replaced the previous slave, feudal, and self-employment relations of production had unintended consequences. Capitalism soon proved to be different from what its revolutionaries had hoped. While it enabled some people to be more free and more independent than slaves, serf, or self-employed subjects of monarchies had been, it also seriously limited freedom, independence, and democracy for many. Capitalism betrayed many of the promises made by its advocates. It produced and reproduced great inequalities of income and wealth. Poverty proved to be as endemic as capitalism seemed equally adept at producing and reproducing both wealth and poverty. The capitalist rich used their wealth to shape and control politics and culture. Democratic forms hid very undemocratic content. The cyclical instability attending capitalism constantly threatened and hurt large numbers of people, and so on. Growing numbers of employees within capitalism began to yearn for better lives. They defined those yearnings first in the familiar terms of the earlier French and American revolutions: equality, fraternity, liberty, and democracy. They criticized a capitalism that failed to deliver those to most people and demanded social changes to achieve them. Many people still continue to want a better, softer, friendlier capitalism, where government regulates and intervenes to achieve more of what the French and American revolutionaries had yearned for and promised. They are also often self-defined as socialists.
However, capitalism's development provoked another, different perspective that also called itself socialism. In that view, capitalism had not broken from slavery, feudalism, and monarchy nearly as much as its advocates had imagined. Slavery had masters slaves, feudalism had lords serfs, and monarchy had king subjects as their key sources of their inequalities, lack of freedom, oppressions, and conflicts. The employer-employee relation of production and capitalism generated parallel problems. Capitalism installed monarchies inside individual workplaces, even as monarchies outside workplaces were rejected. Kings mostly disappeared, but inside workplaces, the owners or their designated boards of directors assumed king-like powers. The book Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Hey, happy Wednesday, or Mittwoch, as they say in Deutschland. It is, it's a pretty bad weather day down in Florida. But, you know, we'll be taking a break from the disaster porn. I am going to talk about the rapid intensification of this storm. And a few other news things today, as well as a whole lot of other stuff. First off, breaking news. This is out of Washington, D.C., I believe. Or no, is it out of Georgia? Actually, I'm not sure where it was. U.S. District Court Judge Beryl Howell. I think Beryl Howell is in D.C., but in any case, Ruby Freeman and her daughter Shay Moss just won a default judgment against Rudy Giuliani. The order says a default judgment will be entered against defendant Rudolph W. Giuliani for his liability for plaintiff's defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, civil conspiracy, and punitive damage claims pursuant to federal rules of civil procedure. She notes that Giuliani now owes Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman $89,000 for which they have paid their attorneys to sue him. Plus, she says that the jury will, or he, I'm not sure if Beryl is a man or a woman, I'm sorry. But in any case, the judge says, as a sanction for defendants' failure to timely reimburse the plaintiffs, the jury will be instructed that they must, when determining an appropriate sum for punitive damages, infer that he is intentionally trying to hide relevant discovery about his financial assets for the purpose of artificially deflating his net worth. In other words, Rudy is hiding some of the money he's got so that they can't sue him for it. Very interesting. I mean, a judge just said this. Not a good thing. All right, meanwhile, we've got a massive storm hitting Florida right now. And, well, actually, it just skipped across southern Georgia as well. It's in the neighborhood of Savannah right now on Georgia's east coast. It's Hurricane Idalia, and I've seen, when it originally hit landfall, the reports were that it was Category 4. Now the TV chyrons are saying that it hit land as a Category 3. It doesn't much matter. This is a part of the state that has never in human memory been hit with a storm like this. And what we're seeing is what's called rapid intensification. That is, a storm shows up and you figure, okay, it's going to get stronger as it goes across the Gulf because the water is warm, but, we can predict how rapidly it's going to. Well, those predictions have just gone to hell in the last 2 decades, in particularly the last 10 years. 16 of the 20 hurricanes that formed in the last 2 years, 2021 and 2022, rapidly intensified, 16 out of 20. It used to be none. Right? 30, 40, 50 years ago. Since 2017, there have been 7 rapidly intensifying storms that hit Category 4 before they hit land. Those 7 storms have caused 3,381 deaths and resulted in more than $469 billion in damage. A study led in 2019 by meteorologist Kiernan Bhatia found that a significant increase in rapidly intensifying hurricanes in the Atlantic since '82
It all began with Reagan, right? I'm telling you, Louise says that's going to be on my tombstone. It all started with Reagan. Anyhow, that since '82, that we've seen these rapidly intensifying hurricanes. They pretty much were not a thing before the 1980s. She says, or this meteorologist writes, when looking only at storms undergoing extreme rapid intensification, a one-day wind increase of more than 57 miles an hour, the annual average climbed from fewer than 20 a year in the early 1990s to more than 30 in the past decade. So here we are. My op-ed today over at HartmannReport.com is not about the weather, it's about education. And so let's take a break from the weather for a moment and talk about, what is the real right-wing agenda in America? I'm arguing that right-wing billionaires and the GOP want a nation of uneducated, compliant serfs. Russell Kirk wrote about this in 1952 in his book, The Conservative Mind, in which he said that, society, from a conservative viewpoint, that society needs orders and classes. It's another way of saying basically a caste system in society. This is a kind of a takeoff on the old Calvinist or neo-Calvinist argument. John Calvin, well, actually, it wasn't John Calvin who said this, it was his followers, but now it's part of Calvinist doctrine. The Calvinist doctrine is that, God has, well, first of all, they believe in predestination. So, in other words, the moment you're born, your entire future has already been mapped out, according to Calvinist theology. The Calvinist Church is headquartered in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Probably its most famous members are the DeVos family, for example. Mr. Prince, Eric Prince, who ran Blackwater, and Betsy DeVos, our education secretary. And they believe that God determines your fate and future even before you're born, and that our job is to try to figure out who are the good people among us versus who are the bad people. That, some people are basically just born evil. They're born, their destiny is to be terrible, and other people are born good. And how do we know who was born good? Who are the people that God wants to rule over us? And what the Calvinists concluded was the way you tell that is by you look at who's blessed with great wealth, since God decided all this before we're born. And this is basically the theology or the worldview that a lot of right-wing billionaires have hooked onto. Now, if you are doomed, if you're damned from birth, why do we need to educate you? Why do we need to pay to put you through school? This is the question that these right-wing billionaires are asking. Shouldn't there be school systems designed for the select, God's chosen few, and everybody else, let them work in the factories? So basically, the conservative line here, which has become the Republican line, and you're seeing this acted out in virtually every red state in the country, is public education needs to be done away with because it's the great leveler, right? Public education is what provides people an opportunity to step up from whatever class they're born into up through the economic and social ladder. And we can't have that in red states. That's not the Republican way. If you're born rich, hey, you're one of God's elect. If you're not born rich, go to work when you're 14 years old. So this is, this is literally their mantra, is kill public education. Florida and Arizona now have fully offered vouchers to every child in the state as just a blatant, upfront effort by Republicans in those two states to destroy the public school systems. Florida defunded their public school system by 10% last year in order to pay for these vouchers. And at the same time, these same billionaires are saying, and red state governors are saying, well, and if we're going to defund the public schools, let's send the kids to work. Sarah Huckabee Sanders dropped the age at which you can work in Arkansas to 14. You can go to work in a meatpacking plant in Arkansas now if you're 14 years old. Screw school.
And what does that do? It establishes multi-generational poverty, which is exactly what Republicans want, because they want an uneducated, compliant workforce. 8 other Republican-controlled red states right now are considering legislation similar to what Sarah Huckabee Sanders signed to drop the age at which you can go to work to 14 or below. A lot of these red states also are dropping the age of consent. So the age at which you can get married is now, in many of these red states, 14, 15, 16. This is the Republican way. And, you know, as I said, the basis of this is this idea that, you know, we don't want America to be the epicenter of social and economic mobility. I mean, we used to be. Prior to the Reagan Revolution, America was the most socially mobile country in the world in the 1950s and 60s. If you were born into poverty, you had a better chance of ending up middle class, upper middle class, even rich in America than any other country in the world in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Reagan put a complete end to that. Today, social mobility in the United States is lower than any other developed country in the world. Why? Because of these Republican policies, gutting public education, you know, eliminating taxes on rich people. The average billionaire in America only pays a 3.4% income tax. I guarantee, you know, if you have any income at all, you're probably paying more than 3.4% because you're not a billionaire, right? We have a two-tier justice system. We're seeing that with Trump. We have a two-tier, you know, not being jailed leading up to his trials. We have a two-tiered economic system, a two-tiered educational system.
Is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So what do we do about this? You need to get active with your local school boards. We need to take back our school boards. And welcome back. Nathan in Santa Rosa, California. Hey, Nathan, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Thank you. It's been great listening to you all through the years.
Well, thank you.
You were talking about the caste system and that whole situation. It reminds me of the movie Metropolis, which illustrates that really well.
I never saw the movie. Tell me about it.
Oh, Fritz Lang, I believe, is the director. Mm-hmm. And it shows this upper-level system who are the rich people and the lower caste system, which is below ground, trying to make the whole upper ground system work. And the movie's about one of the rich folks who come down into the lower caste system and meets this young lady, and about how they grow their relationship through this whole caste system. And it's
kind of like Titanic in that regard.
Oh, my gosh. It's really an incredible, and this was done in 30s.
Wow. Is it black and white?
And so I recommend it. Yes, it's black and white.
Wow.
And it's actually silent. It's one of the early silent movies.
Really?
So, yeah.
Wow. I've never heard of it. I'll have to check it out. Metropolis, you said.
Metropolis, yes. So if anybody else knows about this movie, please feel free to talk about it. It's fabulous.
So in this movie, the wealthy have taken over the surface of the earth, and the poor people are all working in cities below ground?
Correct. And you see where the workers, their job is to maneuver these gigantic clocks, okay? They're to move these hands of these gigantic clocks to keep the industrialization up above going. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, that's why clocks that boom the hours were invented, was to tell workers when they could take a break from their, when they could have their lunch break.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I learned that when I lived in Germany. We lived in this little town, Stadtsteinach, little town of like 13,000 people, I think. And there was a big Catholic church in the middle of the town. And every hour, the church bell rang. And I mean, all day long, you know, it didn't ring at night. But, you know, I got in a conversation with somebody about that, and they were like, yeah, well, this is how it started. It was, back in the, I guess, 1700s when the factories started popping up around Germany and all the churches installed church bells. I mean, I guess many of them had church bells before that they would ring on Sundays. But they started ringing the church bells every hour as a way of, so that the factories could say, okay, if you're supposed to be at work at 8 or at 9 or at 10 or whatever, and here's your lunch break and all that kind of stuff. And so,
Tom, I'm a retired worker bee, and what I see today, from what I can tell, and I'm kind of aware of things, looks like to me we're back to that.
Yeah, I think so. Well, it's definitely the world that the Republicans and the right-wing billionaires want to take us to. Nathan, thanks for the call. It's great to hear from you, and appreciate your first call to the program. It's 21 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls and the news of the day in just a moment. Stay tuned. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. So why is it that Republicans insist on calling Democrats communists? I mean, this is all over the place. Donald Trump recently said, we're going to deny entry all communists and Marxists. Now, the real problem is, what do we do about the ones we already have who happen to be politicians? Nancy Pelosi, Schumer, Shifty Schiff. Ted Cruz told Fox News, Joe Biden has handed the agenda over to the socialists. And not just the socialists, this is now the communists. Today's Democratic Party believes in violence. They believe in mob rule, just like the communists and Marxists. And he goes on. Ron DeSantis, same thing. You see at a college campus, students flying the hammer and sickle from the old Soviet Union flag. There are no communists left in America of any consequence. There's certainly not a single elected communist, but we do have a really serious fascism problem in America. I wrote about this over at HartmannReport.com. It's titled, Why American Fascists Label All Who Oppose Them as Communists. Check it out. And welcome back. So, the conservative war on public education is not, of course, limited to our elementary schools and junior high and high schools, or middle schools and high schools. It's also happening across our university systems, our state-run university systems. West Virginia, for example, a Republican-controlled state. Jim Justice, the governor, was elected as a Democrat, but he flipped to Republican. He changed his party affiliation after he got elected. Shortly, this was the same election that brought Donald Trump in, if my memory is correct. And so this week, hundreds of West Virginia University students, this is from Truth Out, staged a class walkout outside the school student union in Morgantown, West Virginia, to protest an administration proposal to cut 32 academic programs and 169 faculty positions. They were carrying signs that said, "Save world languages, protect the arts, fire President Gordon Gee," he's the president of the university, "stop the cuts." One of the students told Truth Out, quote, "The students of this university are not protesting because we hate this place. We're protesting because we love it so damn much, and we're sick of them bleeding us dry." The university announced its proposal to eliminate nearly 1/10 of its majors, including the entire language department, the entire Department of Literatures and Linguistics. 16% of their faculty, 169 faculty positions, faculty members are going to have their positions eliminated. That includes all 32 faculty in the World Languages Department. If the proposed cuts move forward, WVU students would no longer be able to study Spanish, French, German, Russian, or Chinese, despite the university previously celebrating students who received Truman, Marshall, Fulbright, and Rhodes scholarships which rely on language study. Welcome to the wonderful world of Republican-controlled red states. I mean, this is where we're at. Meanwhile, New Hampshire is looking at Donald Trump with a bit of a jaundiced eye. This is fascinating. Bryant Corky Messner is an attorney and prominent Republican who ran on Trump's endorsement for the Senate in 2020. He lost. But he is now saying, hey, 14th Amendment, Section 3, Donald Trump can't run. And the New Hampshire Attorney General's office says they are, quote, carefully reviewing the legal issues involved. Now, what brought this to the top of the news this week was that on Monday, day before yesterday, Charlie Kirk on his right-wing talk show told listeners that New Hampshire was trying to block Trump from the ballot. So suddenly there's just all these calls into the New Hampshire Secretary of State's office, and people are generally freaking out. New Hampshire Attorney General John Formelia and Secretary of State David Scanlon said in a joint statement that they are probably not going to do this, but what they said was both the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office are aware of public discourse regarding the potential application of Section 3. In other words, we're aware of it. Meanwhile, the prominent RNC member, Bill Palatucci, from New Jersey, is sounding the alarm. He says the RNC needs to have an escape hatch in case Donald Trump gets convicted. He says, given what's happening on the legal front, state parties need to think about what options they're giving themselves. All this is happening so quickly, it's unprecedented, and so as states formulate what the rules are going to be, everyone's got a whole new set of circumstances to consider. Palatucci, by the way, is also an advisor to Chris Christie's super PAC, so you might expect him to have that position. But the RNC, Ronna Romney McDaniel says that we're not planning on this. We're not going to do anything about this. We don't really care. If Donald Trump is a felon, the Republican Party is perfectly happy to have a felon as its candidate for president of the United States. After all, the Republican Party stands for grift and crime and trashing law enforcement. I mean, having a convicted felon as their candidate is perfectly appropriate.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Just ask some of the crime-adjacent Republicans like Matt Gaetz, child sex trafficking, or Jim Jordan, covering up same.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Ezra Klein's new book, Why We're Polarized. This is from the introduction, and it's a couple pages into it. I'm starting out here. I have found that American politics is best understood by braiding two forms of knowledge that are often left separate: the direct, on-the-ground insights shared by politicians, activists, government officials, and other subjects of my reporting, and the more systemic analyses conducted by political scientists, sociologists, historians, and others with the time, methods, and expertise to study American politics at scale. On their own, political actors often ignore the incentives shaping their decisions, and academic researchers miss the human motivations that drive political decision-making. Together, however, they shine bright light on how and why American politics works the way it does. There's much awry in American politics, and I won't in this book attempt to catalog all of it. But I've come to believe the master story, the one that drives almost all divides and most fundamentally shapes the behavior of participants, is the logic of polarization. That logic, put simply, is this: to appeal to a more polarized public, political institutions and political actors behave in more polarized ways. As political institutions and actors become more polarized, they further polarize the public. This sets off a feedback cycle. To appeal to a yet more polarized public, institutions must polarize further. When faced with yet more polarized institutions, the public polarizes further, and so on. Understanding that we exist in relationship with our political institutions, that they are changed by us and we are changed by them, is the key to this story. We don't just use politics for our own ends. Politics uses us for its own ends. There are many different types of polarization possible, and I'll discuss some of them later in the book, but the locus of polarization I'll discuss is on political identity. And that requires saying a few words about a term that should be very useful in American politics, but that has become almost useless: identity politics. A core argument of this book is that everyone engaged in American politics is engaged in identity politics. This is not an insult, and it's not controversial. We form and fold identities constantly, naturally. Identity is present in politics in the way gravity, evolution, or cognition is present in politics. That is to say, it is omnipresent in politics because it is omnipresent in us. There is no way to read the literature on how humans form and protect their personal and group identities, literature I will survey in this book, and believe that any of us is immune. It runs so deep in our psyches, so activated so easily by even weak cues and distant threats, that it is impossible to speak seriously about how we engage with one another without discussing how our identities shape that engagement. Unfortunately, the term identity politics has been weaponized. It is most often used by speakers to describe politics as practiced by members of historically marginalized groups. If you're black and you're worried about police brutality, that's identity politics. If you're a woman and you're worried about the male-female pay gap, that's identity politics. But if you're a rural gun owner decrying universal background checks as tyranny, or a billionaire CEO complaining that high tax rates demonize success, or a Christian insisting on nativity scenes in public squares, well, that's just good old-fashioned politics. With a quick sleight of hand, identity becomes something that only marginalized groups have. The term identity politics in this usage obscures rather than illuminates. It's used to diminish and discredit the concerns of weaker groups by making them look self-interested, special pleading in order to clear the agenda for the concerns of stronger groups, which are framed as more rational, proper topics for normal political debate. But in wielding identity as a blade, we have lost it as a lens, blinding ourselves in a bid for political advantage. We're left searching in vain for what we refuse to allow ourselves to see. All politics is influenced by identity. Those identities are most powerful when they are so pervasive as to be either invisible or uncontroversial. American is an identity. So too is Christian. When politicians, including the irreligious, end speeches with "God bless America," it's not because they're making an appeal to a higher power, but because they're making an appeal to our bedrock identities. If you don't believe me, ask yourself why there are so few open atheists or even agnostics in national politics. This does not mean that politics is an equation solved by locating identity. Identity shapes our worldview, but it does not mechanistically decide it. And while we often speak of identity as a singular, it is always a dizzying plural. We have countless identities, some of them in active conflict with each other, others lying dormant until activated by threat or fortune. Much that happens in political campaigns is best understood as a struggle over which identities voters will inhabit come election day. Will they feel like workers exploited by their bosses, or heartlanders dismissed by coastal elites? Will they vote as patriotic traditionalists offended by NFL players who kneel during the national anthem, or as parents worried about the climate their children will inhabit? What we are often fighting over in American politics is group identity and status, fights that express themselves in debates over policy and power, but cannot be truly reconciled by either. Health policy is positive-sum, but identity conflict is zero-sum. The book Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein.
Did you know that every weekday we send out an email before the show giving you all the topics coming up so you can be fully informed and ready to interact with our program? Or that after the show we send out Sue's Stack, a list of every topic I've discussed along with clickable hot links to every source of information I've shared with you on the air? It's all completely free and available over at thom.tv, THOM.tv. Check it out. 34 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. And let's pick up some of your phone calls and see what's on your mind as disaster porn fills our TV airwaves, generally speaking. I don't understand why they do that. You know, I mean, there's other stuff going on in the world. Hey, I realize it's a grim story for people in Florida, but Deborah in Chicago. Hey, Deborah, what's on your mind today?
Thank you, Tom, and thanks for accepting my call. Your topic about, again, the Republicans. Tom, politics is local. 65, living in Chicago, and there hasn't been anything different that has happened for people of the South and the West Side in terms of resources. No different than what you're saying as far as Reagan. I'm confident that 45 knows the politics and how the vote has been weaponized. Get people to vote, and people have become apathetic to voting. You have all of these politicians who've been in for decades and weaponized everything. So people throw up their hands. And in fact, from what I'm gathering, because of the lack of resources, and you have those coming in illegally, those who are coming for asylum seekers and others, resources have been stripped of the people who've been here. We're talking about never have had. Look at the school system, the mental health facilities and others. But Rahm Emanuel and put his finger to the people over in Japan. Is that why that's happening in Japan, and the nuclear and what's happening there, that the administration would send him there, that since he bamboozled or he gave the finger to leadership here, that he can overtake the Japanese people there?
I doubt it, but he is a good neoliberal, Rahm Emanuel. He did the dance on behalf of the billionaires in Chicago for a number of years, privatizing your parking meters and everything else. You know, I get it that the schools are in a crisis. This is typically the case in communities that are very poor. And there's two pieces to that. One, children of poverty bring their own problems into the classroom. Number one, but probably more important, we have a system set up in the United States nationwide where school systems are funded locally. And the reason for this being set up this way over, about 120 years ago was that way wealthy neighborhoods can continue to have nice schools and poor neighborhoods get crapped on, frankly. It's a system trying to perpetuate itself, and it's broken and it needs to be repaired. But the solution is not to do what Florida and Arizona have done, which is try to end all public schools. No, not at all, not at all. But in fact, it is the blue dog. Is that the case in the other states and cities where they've had the blue dogs and I'm thinking that once Rahm left here and Lori Lightfoot came in and took over, that Jason Van Dyke and your callers may not realize what this is about. The police officer and Rahm Emanuel covered up the killing of the 16-year-old, covered it up. And the fact that all of along, thousands of black teachers were laid off. Once you close the schools, you get rid of the teachers, you close the mental health facility. What else could come about this but crime? Yeah, no, this Rahm Emanuel was totally down as far as I know. I mean, if Chicago listeners feel free to call and correct me, but from, because I don't live in Chicago, but looking at it from afar, it sure looked to me like he was down with the billionaire agenda of destroying public education. He closed a whole bunch of Chicago public schools. I recall that. And if I could say this before, and I won't take up much more of your time, because Lori Lightfoot, when she came in and the misogyny, when she first got in, and I know you don't know this, but when she first got in, the city council, they were barking at her like a dog, literally barking. And she had no coverage, nobody. Being female, being black, being lesbian, I mean, she had three strikes against her right from the get-go. But, she has stood up well against them. That should have been reported. Yeah. And there were those who, and to put
thank you for accepting. I'm just so disgusted.
No, I get it, Deborah. I get it, and you know, it really is a crisis, and we need to
hidden history.
Yeah.
You look at this, Tom, please, and D.C., and how long incumbents have been in, because if you weaponize and people won't vote and are scared to vote because of dissension, you speak out, you're targeted.
I get it. Deborah, thank you for the call. Ray, in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, is it Bear Bar? How do you say that, Pennsylvania? It's Wilkes-Barre, isn't it? Wilkes-Barre. Okay, thank you.
Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania.
So what's up?
Tom, I listened with keen interest to your reflection on upward mobility in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And having been alive during those generations, those decades.
Yeah, me too.
And during my youth, I began to reflect, using whether it's inductive or deductive reasoning. I asked myself the question, well, what has changed? What in our society has changed since those 30 years? And interestingly, I come to the conclusion that the only thing that's changed, and changed radically, and changed dramatically, is the size of government.
No, that's not it at all, Ray. Actually, the size of government has not changed radically or dramatically. Our federal government as a percentage of GDP is not that much larger than it was in the 1980s. But here is what has changed, Ray, and let me just lay it out for you. It's pretty simple and straightforward. Number one, in the 1960s and 70s, prior to Reagan taking a meat axe to the unions in the United States, 2/3 of America were in the middle class because 1/3 of America had a union job. A good union job, and that union jobs, those union jobs established the pay floor for non-union employers. So 2/3 of Americans had the equivalent of a good union job. And the result of that, having that good union job, was that they could get into the middle class, they could send their kids to college. My dad worked in a tool and die shop, and yet he was able to raise 4 boys. He was able to live a good middle class life and provide essentially a launching pad for me to become a successful entrepreneur, number one. Number two, in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, you had a top income tax rate on billionaires of 74%. In fact, prior to 1967, it was 91%. Now you've got billionaires paying 3.4%, which means that the rest of us have to pick up that tax load, that tax burden, as it were. And the billionaires are not. So, you've got a social mobility issue there. Number three, in the 1960s, 70s, and early 1980s, you could get a college education working a part-time job. I went to both Lansing Community College and Michigan State University, working at Bob's Big Boy on Trowbridge Road in East Lansing as a dishwasher, and working at the gas station across the street, the Esso station, replacing brakes and pumping gas. You could put yourself through college that way. I didn't know anybody outside of one friend of mine who was working on his master's degree in mathematics who had a college loan, who had a student loan back in the 60s. So those are the things that have really changed in America, Ray, that have basically destroyed the ability of working class people to get into the upper middle class.
Or do you let people with different points of view express themselves, or do you just talk over them?
Well, I noticed that you were trying to talk over me throughout my riff, so Sean potted you down. But I'll let you speak. You're still on the phone.
Yours is a diatribe.
It wasn't a diatribe. It was a list of real things that were the difference between then and now.
The union movement priced itself out of business.
No, it didn't.
And it was the Democrat Party.
There is no such thing as a Democrat Party, Ray. There is literally no such thing as a Democrat Party. Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush negotiated NAFTA. The whole neoliberal send your jobs to China thing was a Republican thing. I'll grant you, Bill Clinton bought into it. He promoted it. He signed the legislation. But George Herbert Walker Bush negotiated that legislation. We were betrayed by both parties, frankly, back during that time, but it was the Republicans who started it. Ray, I'm going to move along. I think you've had your say. Michelle in Van Nuys, California. Hey, Michelle, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I was just, sorry, I'm flabbergasted by that guy, but I was just going to also talk about, mention Metropolis, since that other guy was talking about that.
Oh, the movie,
It's an amazing film. There's actually 2 versions of it out. And I suggest you look for a version that was done just a couple of years ago. They actually found about 20 minutes of missing film from in some foreign country and spliced it into it to.
I think the film was produced in Germany or France, wasn't it?
Yes. But this was some like out of the way country that actually had a copy of the film because there was and so they spliced in. So you can actually see when it's spliced in.
Oh, Sean says it was Argentina. She's familiar with the movie.
Oh, okay. Yes. It is. I just couldn't remember because it's been a few years since I've watched it.
Some good Germans must have taken it with them when they fled Nazi Germany.
Oh, it was actually shown all over, but I mean, first, he was an amazingly popular movie maker.
Right.
So it's not like this was his only movie. He's done some other really good stuff, but he, like I said, it's visually beautiful. I think it has the version I saw had subtitles with the German. The little silent movie where they have words in German, but there were subtitles when they had that. But like I said, look for the extended version because it has that extra bit, and it really is an amazing. It fits in very much with our time and what the gentleman was saying. Yes, it's about a 2-class society that the worker people all live down below the ground, and the upper people live up. They're all blonde and live in an upper area, and they have like this beautiful place to play in, and it's just like a wonderful place, and they don't mix at all. There's guards actually at like elevators to make sure that people don't mix.
Oh, interesting.
And so it's a very it's 2-class society, and the worker people are basically being worked to death.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just, if somebody collapses while on the job, somebody carts them off and throws another person onto what they're doing. And they're actually physically, you have to see it, but they're actually physically manning the machine that runs the upper area.
Amazing. I'll have to, both Nate and Sean have seen this movie and they're raving about it. So I've got to check it. It was made in 1927 in Germany. It's incredible. I'm going to have to look it up. Michelle, thank you.
It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Rick in Indianapolis. Hey, Rick, what's on your mind today?
Hey, thank you, Tom, for taking my call. I'm a retired educator and taught in the public school systems. And these initiatives drove me out of education. They were just sucking the life out of me.
Yeah, you're in a red state, so that makes sense.
Well, yes. And Mitch Daniels was the governor at the time, along with his Department of Ed head, Tony Bennett, and they were just, I was wondering why they were attacking public education. And I just got tired of it and retired, and I started doing research on my own and come across Gerald Bracey's books, and one that I think every person should read is On the Death of Childhood and the Destruction of Public Schools, the Folly of Today's Education Policies and Practices. It is an excellent book outlining how we arrived at this particular point, and one of them was Ed Rust, the CEO of State Farm, who was on the Business Roundtable for Public Education Initiative.
Oh, God save us from the Business Roundtable. So what's the author's name, Rick?
His name is Gerald Bracey. He's no longer with us, but he has several books.
I'll check it out. Rick, I'm sorry we're out of time. I got to run, but thank you for the call, and thank you for the information.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's 48 minutes past the hour. Back with more of your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Rob in Waconia, Minnesota. Hey, Rob, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. I did the cut and paste email thing from Dean Obeidallah about...
Oh, great. Did you get a response?
I got a response from Steve Simon, the Secretary of State here in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, I'm reading the email here, the Minnesota Office of Secretary of State does not have legal authority to investigate a candidate's eligibility for office. He goes on to say basically that the parties send in the names of their candidates and they just basically accept them and put them on the ballot unless the court says otherwise.
Is he citing federal or state law?
State law.
Yeah, okay.
He also says Minnesota law provides a separate legal process found in Minnesota Statute 204B.44, which allows one or more people to challenge in court the eligibility of a candidate to appear on the ballot.
Right.
We will continue to honor the outcome of that process as we have in the past.
Which is, it sounds like it's a wink and a nod way of saying you need to challenge Trump with the court system rather than with our office.
Basically, yes, I believe so.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Well, good on you, Rick.
Yeah.
Rob, excuse me, for picking up that baton and running with it. That's great.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for the report and thanks for the information. I do appreciate that. Roya in Los Angeles. Hey, Roya, thanks for listening to KPFK. What's up?
Hi, Tom. I know it's like hump day, and I just wanted to have a little fun little ditty for you to sing for you.
Okay.
It goes like this. Bad orange man, he's going down. Bad orange man, he's going down, 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 down. He's going down. Yeah. That's it, my friend.
Okay, I got it. Thanks, Roya. James in Longmont, Colorado. Hey, James, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I was wondering if you have come across this thing called Project 2025 that the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, I have talked about it and written about it. I need to do a more in-depth piece because it's pretty nasty. It's pretty.
Yeah.
It's basically take America back to 1910.
Well, or take America to Nazi Germany, more like it. I've been kind of reading over it, and this plan is
what's the parallel to Nazi Germany?
Well, they want to take control of industry, take control of federal law enforcement, do away with Congress. There's.
Oh yeah, there's
some parallels
executive
there.
Power stuff. Yeah, okay, I get it.
Yeah, and it's funny how Trump and his followers are pointing at the left, saying you are the fascists, you are the problem, and then they have this plan sitting on the back burner. And I don't think Trump's going to win the election. I don't even think he's going to be on the ballot. But the thing is the Heritage Foundation is going to continue to push this plan until they get someone in that seat,
right,
to do that. And more people need to be aware of this. And I would really like it if you did a piece on that, go more in depth with it.
I will.
It's scary
I absolutely
stuff.
will. It's on my list. James, thank you for the call. It is an important issue. Thank you. It's 52 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls in 60 seconds. Stay with us. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, or one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio and tag you're it. Between 40 years of Ronald Reagan's neoliberalism destroying the American middle class and all the just horrors of January 6th and the Trump presidency, America's waking up, and that's a really good thing. There's actually, some books coming out about this. Mine, The Hidden History of Democracy. Neil Howe's The Fourth Turning is here. And it looks like a moment of American renaissance is upon us, if our media doesn't screw it up, which raises the question, can we have democracy and Fox News? Can the two coexist? Like, when Fox News runs chyrons saying that essentially Joe Biden is a wannabe dictator who's throwing Trump in jail because he's his political opponent. There's a whole rant about this and an in-depth analysis of what can we do with regard to repairing our media here in the United States over at HartmannReport.com. I think you'll find it interesting. Check it out. 54 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls here. Marie in Atlanta. Hey, Marie, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I was listening to your opening rant regarding the Republicans raising the age of consent, lowering the age of eligibility for marriage, all sorts of things that have to do with changing what sorts of things minors can legally be involved in, and how they can essentially be making very, very adult decisions at inappropriately young ages.
At 14, yeah.
Exactly. But I wanted to point out specifically how, with respect to young kids and sexual activity, it's going to happen. They do that.
Yeah.
If a young girl is eligible for, is now at the age of consent at 14, note that some of the claims of statutory rape and the eligibility for an abortion in those states that carve out an exception for rape, that goes away.
Oh, interesting.
Or it certainly becomes much more easy to challenge.
Yeah.
Second of all, it makes it easier to force that young girl to get married at the age of 14.
Yeah, well, I think that's the point. I think this is, this is patriarchy on steroids.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I just wanted to point that out because I'm not sure that, everyone would make that connection.
Yeah. Great point. Marie, thank you very much. That was an important appendix to my rant. Thank you. Peter in Chicago. Hey, Peter, I just have a little less than a minute here. You got a quick one?
Yeah, I'd just say Lori Lightfoot was better than Emmanuel, but she didn't keep her promise about opening the mental health centers and the schools that he closed. I don't know what happened on the city council, but and Daley started a lot of BS too before Emmanuel, when he took the conductors off the public transit trains in Chicago.
Yeah. Yeah,
that's all I wanted to say.
That's interesting. Yeah, no mayor can do everything all by themselves. They've got to have the city council, just like president can't do things if Congress doesn't act. But that may or may not be an excuse. I am not sufficiently wired into Chicago politics to be able to have a thoughtful opinion on this. So I'll leave that to Joan and my other colleagues on WCPT. But I totally get it. I can tell you that I was very aware of Rahm Emanuel, and I thought he was just another neocon, just another neoliberal, not a neocon, a neoliberal.
Bruce Rauner in Springfield.
Yeah. Peter, thank you for the call. We're hitting the top of the hour here on the other side of this break. I forgot to print my one sheet this morning. I knew I was missing something. What's up here? Okay, DeSantis is moving to help law-breaking cops. Oh, yeah. I got to tell you about this. This is amazing. Stay with us. We'll be right
back. You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at ThomHartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the HartmannReport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at ThomHartmann.com. So check them all out at ThomHartmann.com and HartmannReport.com.
We say fight back!
everything from dark money, the hidden history of the billionaires behind the rise of the radical right, in today's Thom Hartmann University Book Club. This is from chapter 11, page 271. The official opening of the 112th Congress took place on January 5th, 2011, when Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, handed off an oversized ceremonial gavel to her successor, John Boehner. But a new era of ultra-conservative billionaire influence had already begun. Before the public swearing-in ceremony got underway, David Koch, whose donor network had spent at least $130.7 million on winning a Republican majority, was in the new Speaker-to-be's office, ornate office, chatting amiably with his staff. The People's House was under new management, and critics would suggest new ownership. While Koch was a very public presence on the Capitol, his political adjutant, Tim Phillips, the president of Americans for Prosperity, was deep in the inner sanctum of the congressional committee that mattered most to the bottom line of Koch Industries. Phillips's most important destination that day was the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which under the new Republican majority had now increased its power to block President Obama's environmental agenda in Congress. The committee could bury progress on climate change and harass the EPA for the foreseeable future. And then just jumping through a little anecdote about Lee Fong and David Koch, they continue. In Plutocrats, the rise of the new global super-rich and the fall of everyone else, journalist Krista Freeland describes how those with massive financial resources almost universally use them to secure politics and policies beneficial to their interests, often at the expense of the less well-off. In the United States, a number of studies have shown that in recent years, this tendency has distorted politics in very specific ways. In a study he conducted for the nonpartisan Sunlight Foundation, the political scientist Lee Drutman found that increasingly concentrated wealth in America resulted in more polarization and extremism, especially on the right. Very rich benefactors in the Republican Party were far more opposed to taxes and regulations than the rest of the country. He discovered the more Republicans depend upon 1% of the 1% donors, the more conservative they tend to be. The 112th Congress soon unfolded as a case study of what David Frum, an advisor to the former President George W. Bush, described as the growing and, in his view, destructive influence of the Republican Party's radical rich. The radicalization of the party's donor base, he observed, has propelled the party to advocate policies that were more extreme than anything since Barry Goldwater and his 1964 presidential campaign. It also led Republicans in Congress to try tactics they would never have dared use before, end quote. Hard data supported this. Harvard's Theta Scott poll found that the House took the biggest leap to the far right since political scientists began recording quantitative measurements of legislators' positions. There was no better example than the Koch's newly won influence over the House Energy and Commerce Committee. In the previous Congress, the panel had been chaired by Henry Waxman, a liberal Democrat from California, who had quarterbacked the House's successful passage of the cap and trade bill, only to see it die in the Senate. Now the new Republican leadership stocked the committee with oil industry advocates, many of whom owed huge campaign debts to the Kochs. Koch Industries' PAC was the single largest oil and gas industry donor to members of the panel, outspending even ExxonMobil. It had donated to 22 of the committee's 31 Republican members and 5 of its Democratic members, too. In addition, 5 out of the 6 Republican freshmen on the committee had received outside support from Americans for Prosperity. Meanwhile, many of the new committee members had signed an unusual pledge swearing fealty to the Koch's agenda. They promised to vote against any kind of carbon tax unless it was offset by comparable spending cuts, an unlikely scenario. The no climate tax pledge was invented by Americans for Prosperity in 2008, when the Supreme Court cleared the way for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases as it does other pollutants. The Koch's pledge was modeled on the enormously successful one that the anti-tax crusader Grover Norquist had used to intimidate Republican lawmakers from raising taxes. But in this instance, it served not a cause so much as a company. By the start of the legislative session in 2011, fully 156 members of Congress had signed the Koch brothers' no climate tax pledge. Many returning members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee had already taken the pledge, and of the 12 new Republicans on the panel, 9 were signatories, including 5 of the 6 freshmen. A prime example of the symbiotic relationship between the Kochs and the committee was Morgan Griffith, who had defeated Rick Boucher in the district that represented Saltville, Virginia, and was among the new wave of appointees to the Energy and Commerce Committee who were openly indebted to the Koch brothers for their seats. Americans for Prosperity operatives were guests of honor at a victory rally soon after the election, at which Griffith gushed, quote, "I'm just thankful that y'all helped me out in so many ways," end quote. The Koch's investment soon paid off. Once in office, Griffith became an outspoken skeptic of mainstream climate science, drawing national ridicule for lecturing scientific experts as they testified before Congress that they needed to consider the possibility that Mesopotamia and the Vikings owed their success to global warming, and the melting ice caps on Mars showed that humans were not its cause on Earth. Congressman Griffith became a lead player in the House Republicans' war on the EPA, demanding that the agency be reined in. Within a month after he took office, he and other House Republicans gutted the EPA budget by a punishing 27%. Dark Money, the hidden history of the billionaires behind the rise of the radical right, by Jane Mayer.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome to the second hour of our program. Oh my God. Ron DeSantis is moving to help lawbreaking cops. I mean, is there no bottom for this guy? He has fired 2 elected prosecutors in Florida. The first one he fired a few months ago. He fired that guy because he said that he would not prosecute women for getting abortions. The one that he just fired, Monique Worrell, Orlando area state attorney Monique Worrell, he fired her as she was about to complete an investigation of 20 police officers for corruption. I'm not making this up. DeSantis, this is just incredible, this story. These cops, they arrested somebody. This is what Worrell told the Daily Beast. They took him into custody without a warrant, went into his pants pocket without a warrant, clicked his key fob without a warrant, went in without a warrant into his car. There's this little thing called unreasonable search and seizure, and you can't get evidence without a warrant. We were unable to go forward with charges because it was an illegal search and seizure. So she, instead of prosecuting the bad guys because the cops misbehaved and she couldn't, she started looking into the behavior of the cops. And that was too much for Ron DeSantis. You recall at the Republican debate, he said, well, you know, I got rid of a district attorney who was anti-cop, or words to that effect. Well, this is the story. It was a rogue police department. And then this Aldous Pennyfarthing writing over on Daily Kos says, Daily Kos says, but while DeSantis is using these firings to burnish his anti-woke bona fides, his true motivation may be even more sinister. At the time of the firing, Worrell's investigators were reportedly on the tail end of a corruption investigation into the Osceola County Sheriff's Office, and the interruption would be a welcome relief to majors who kept phoning friends at the state attorney's office, were nervously checking for updates in recent weeks. This is what the Worrell told the Daily Beast. As we were investigating, there was all sorts of illegal activity that started coming up. Officers signing each other's reports, getting them notarized in someone else's name when they signed them themselves, fraudulent documents. In other words, the party of law and order is only about law and order when they're using law and order to keep down basically black people. But hey, if cops are misbehaving, Ron DeSantis is right there with them. And you wonder why I call this guy a fascist. I mean, that is one of the hallmarks of fascism, is a fetish for law enforcement, a fetish for, frankly, violent law enforcement. Speaking of the same, another day, another outright hoax promoted on Fox so-called news. Over the weekend, 3 hours of gaudy coverage of a straight-up news hoax. Remember Victor Shokin? Victor Shokin was the Inspector General for Ukraine, who was supposed to be the guy who looked into Ukraine corruption. And he was supposed to be investigating Burisma at the time that Hunter Biden was on its board. And Joe Biden was vice president. And Joe Biden got this guy fired because he wasn't investigating Burisma. He was being paid off, apparently, by Burisma. The guy was corrupt. They fired him. They replaced him with somebody who actually did prosecute Burisma. Republicans, of course, go, oh, yeah, he fired the guy who was investigating Burisma when his son was on the board, which is true. But they don't tell you the other half of the story, that the reason that Biden said we need to fire this guy, or that the Ukrainians need to fire him, the reason Biden signed on for the pressure campaign to fire him, was because he was not prosecuting a corrupt company. And if anybody would know about that corruption, I guess it would be, Biden. So Victor Shokin comes on to Fox News with Brian Kilmeade. I don't know if you saw the story this morning, by the way. Brett Baer, the news guy on Fox News, he makes $14 million a year. He just bought a $34 million house in Florida. Wow. I mean, these guys are paid really, really well to shovel the horse manure that they shovel out every day. Anyhow, Brian Kilmeade thought it would be a fine idea to have Victor Shokin, the corrupt, disgraced, fired Inspector General, on his program. And in that interview, Shokin regurgitated the same conspiracy theory that Rudy Giuliani tried to bring back to the United States. Oh, yeah, he was trying to get rid of me because I was looking into the company. No, it's not true. There's literally not a shred of evidence to back Shokin's theory. In fact, Media Matters tallied up Fox's promotion of his completely hoax-premised claims against Biden and found that on Fox News, the Shokin interview led to, quote, at least 50 segments across 19 different programs. That's a really heavy media push to try to portray Joe Biden as corrupt when actually he was the anti-corruption, what would you call it, leader, campaigner? It's just incredible. And, of course, for the same reason, Republicans in Georgia now are talking about defunding Fani Willis, because how dare you hold a corrupt Republican to account? Well, in her case, 19 corrupt Republicans. Isn't it fascinating, by the way, that Jack Smith has, I believe it's 82, I could be wrong, 80 some odd anyway, known, listed witnesses in his case against Donald Trump, and every single one of them is a Republican who are lining up to testify that Donald Trump committed crimes. Every one is a Republican. All of the witnesses, to the best of my knowledge, that Fani Willis has are Republicans. You would think that if a political party had a corrupt member and had other corrupt people within the party who were collaborating with that corrupt member to commit a major felony crime against the United States of America, defrauding the government, stealing an election, you would think that that political party would welcome a prosecutor who wanted to clean up the party for them. But no. Georgia State Senator Colton Moore was on Steve Bannon's little podcast the other day, and he said, it's just like Nazi Germany. I mean, they want to call us the Nazis, but their actions are Nazism. I mean, first they go after your enemies. Seriously. This guy is going to quote Pastor Niemöller, right? Okay. First they go after your enemies, and you don't say anything because they're your enemies, and that's exactly where the governor is right now. See, he's accusing Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, of being in on this thing because Brian Kemp doesn't like Trump either, and Brian Kemp has been spoken of as a possible candidate to run against Trump in the primaries, although he has not yet stepped up. He says, so you don't say anything because they're your enemies, and that's exactly where the governor is right now. He looks at Donald Trump as an enemy, so he's like, I'm not going to say anything, right? And then they come after your friends. I got a friend who's being indicted. Well, hey, if you've got a friend who's being indicted,
you might want to reconsider your friendship. But then this guy goes completely bat guano crazy. He says, you want a civil war? I don't want a civil war. I don't want to have to draw my rifle. I want to make this problem go away with my legislative means of doing so, and the first step to getting that done is defunding Fani Willis of any Georgia tax dollars. You see, Brian Kemp signed a law back in May that starting on October 1st, a commission which has 5 members who are all appointed by Brian Kemp, Republican members appointed by a Republican governor, who then have the power to do what I was just talking a minute ago about DeSantis doing down in Florida, where he fired 2 of his prosecutors, 2 elected state prosecutors. Fani Willis is also an elected district attorney. DeSantis fired 2 elected prosecutors because they were, God forbid, Democrats. In Georgia, you couldn't do that until the legislature passed this law. So starting in October, this 5-person commission can recommend to the governor that any particular district attorney in the state of Georgia be fired. And guess who the only district attorney in the state of Georgia anybody's talking about firing is right now? Yeah, you guessed it, Fani Willis. When are the Republicans going to just clean up their act? I mean, this is a serious question. What do you think it's going to take for the GOP to say, you know, enough? I realize probably most people listening to this program are not old enough to remember Dwight Eisenhower. I am, and I do remember Dwight Eisenhower. I remember him very well. He was the president throughout most of my childhood. And he was a good man in many regards. I mean, and, you know, obviously he wasn't, you know, Joe Progressive, but can you imagine Dwight Eisenhower saying, we're all in support of a president who tried to overturn an election, who lied to the American people about having lost an election, who conspired to flip an election? I can't imagine it. I can imagine Richard Nixon going along with it in the background quietly, or Ronald Reagan, or even George W. Bush, maybe. But I can't imagine my dad's Republican Party. My dad called himself an Eisenhower Republican. I can't imagine my dad's Republican Party doing that. This GOP, today's GOP, just went to hell in the 1970s. And in part, you know, I mean, you had Lewis Powell in 1971 with his memo about how billionaires and big corporations need to take over a political party and then use that political party to take over America. And then in 76 and 78, you had the Supreme Court legalizing bribery, political bribery. And the GOP saying, yeah, we'll take all that money. The Democrats were, you know, not so interested at the time because they had all this union money. That went away quick. Once Ronald Reagan declared a war on unions, and then the Supreme Court jumped in along with him and said, oh yeah, you know, this, you can gut unions if you want. And red state after red state flipped to being, you know, right. It's incredible. What's it going to take? Serious question. What do you think it's going to take for the GOP to say, you know, we're not going to go with crime anymore as a political strategy? We're just, you know, we'll just lay out our ideas and let whoever, you know, whoever has the best ideas win. I'm skeptical, frankly.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I'm not holding my breath on this one. But what say you? I'll pick up your calls on the other side of the break. It's 18 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. Everything looks good here. All right, let's pick up some of your phone calls. Tim in Aloha, Oregon. Hey, Tim, what's on your mind today? Hey, Tim, how did the city of Aloha, Oregon come up with the name Aloha? Was it named after a person, or did they name it after the Hawaiian greeting?
You know, it's kind of obscure because, you know, Aloha isn't actually a city. You know, we're not incorporated here, you know, because we get a lot of mail that says Beaverton on it, you know. So I've done some research, and I could never find that out. And, you know, it's funny because when I talk to friends across the country, they say aloha. What is? Are you guys Hawaiian? You know,
yeah.
It cracks them up, you know. But yeah, it's you know, my education is history. We've talked about this before. I've been on your program a number of times. I grew up during the height of the Eisenhower administration too. You know, if you look at some of his speeches, he talked about the military-industrial complex. Basically, he just followed up what Roosevelt and Truman wanted to do.
That's right.
My dad was a disabled World War II vet, was able to get a loan through the GI Bill, buy a house for $10,000, raise 5 boys, you know, in a nice little neighborhood.
Yep.
My mom was a homemaker.
My dad did the same thing. Our house was $13,000.
My dad's was 10.
Yeah,
you know?
1956.
He put $300 down. You know, I still remember that. It's an amazing era, and it changed the world. There's no question about it. That built the middle class.
Yep.
There was a guy named Henry Dolger in that area. This is in south of San Francisco along the beach, and he built those homes. And we had wonderful teachers, you know, who knew the value of an education. You know, weren't concerned about their PERS programs, you know. And if you ever called a teacher by their first name in that area, you went to Miss Drury's office. You were in big trouble, you know. But that's exactly it. But one real quick thing I wanted to talk to you about. I called in yesterday, but I couldn't get on because you were about ready to go off the air. A perfect summary of what's going on in the media. When they had MSNBC had the live broadcast from the East Room in the White House with Biden talking about the inflation and the drug guidelines he wants to follow. I switched to CNN, and nothing on there, of course, about it, because I call them Fox News number 2. When Tucker Carlson got off, they started heading in that direction. And then Fox News, I flipped to them, and you talk about scary. They had the My Pillow guy on doing an extended commercial. So that kind of summarizes what's going on in the media, and you're talking about that. That's why they know that bad news makes billions of dollars, basically. You see?
Yeah.
And that's why they're all rich, you know, because they don't. Why would they come on TV each day? Which Rachel Maddow came on and said, "Look, Roe versus Wade is intact again. We have wonderful climate energy policies in New York. That's the news. See you tomorrow." They don't want to do that. They say tune in at 7 because you're all going to die, you know, and then they have peanut butter and Viagra commercials, you know, basically is what it amounts to.
Well, the simple reality is that, you know, good news generally doesn't sell. I mean, it's just, sadly, you know, it's not really news. It's if it bleeds, it leads, is the old saying, and it's true.
It's like running down the highway and an accident. Everybody rubbernecks and slows down.
Yeah, people slow down
out of there, so the thing can be taken care of.
Yeah, people slow down for car wrecks and fistfights, and
that's
you know,
basically it. Yeah, I mean, you know, we're about the same age, and I grew up in that generation, and I was in a wonderful union years ago and stuff, and you know, it was about 26 to 27% in the late 70s before Reagan got into office. Now it's 2 or 3%, 3 or 4%.
What, unionization?
That has made
density?
a difference.
6% in the private sector.
Yeah, exactly. That's made a difference in the way that society operates.
Oh, it absolutely has. It absolutely has. Tim, thanks for the call. Good to hear from you. It is 22 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls on the other side of this break. Stay with us. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, talk media for the sane among us. Yes, we're still here. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. You know, one of the grand questions that political scientists have been scratching their heads over for years in America is, why do right-wing billionaires fund anti-black history movements? Why are they pouring money into these people? Why are they funding anti-trans movements? I mean, what does this have to do with being a billionaire? Well, it turns out it has a lot to do with it, and here's why. Almost 30 million Americans lack health insurance. 37 million of us live in dire poverty. 1 in 5 of us are illiterate. A quarter of Americans suffer from a diagnosable mental illness and can't get treatment. 316 people are shot every day in America. 44% of us carry student debt. And the billionaires don't want to pay income taxes to deal with any of these problems of society. That's the real issue. If they can get us fighting with each other over black history or over trans people or kids, they win. Then we're not talking about taxing them, raising their taxes to where they should be. There's a whole rant about this over at HartmannReport.com that you can read and see all the stats and all the hot links. Check it out. It's 24 minutes past the hour. Picking up your calls here. Terry in Rochester, Washington. Hey, Terry, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, I'm talking mainly the thoughts about the climate crisis we're in right now. But my question is, here, a simple example is if you have a table, an old table you like, and it's got a broken leg, you step back from that table and you devise a little plan in your head, and then you repair the table. And my question is, a lot of these problems are psyche problems out here in the world, especially environmental problems. Can you fix a psychological problem the same way with the same mind that you fix that table with?
Well, I think, some people have psychological problems that are the result of nature. They were born that way, or there's some kind of disequilibrium in their brains. And some people have psychological problems as the result of nurture. They've experienced generally trauma or crisis that has wounded them. For the former,
they're both brain damage.
No, I get that. They're both suffering, let's say. Now, for the former, there are workarounds. I mean, like ADHD, for example. I mean, I wrote a whole book on strategies. It's called ADD Success Stories, on strategies that young people can use to get around their own ADD and, in fact, even turn it into an asset. For people who are wounded, there's also, I wrote another book on that called Walking Your Blues Away, which is about EMDR and bilateral therapies and hypnosis and stuff like that, ways that people can help themselves. There's, the whole self-help arena, and of course therapy. I mean, there's cognitive behavioral therapy is my favorite, frankly. But there are some really good therapeutic systems out there that people who have been damaged by life can use to undo the damage, or at least soften the impact of the damage and work around it in their lives. I think the larger question, Terry, is how do we do this as a society? I believe that the entire United States is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of both the Trump presidency and the pandemic, and the way that Trump screwed up the response to the pandemic, leading to 700,000 unnecessary deaths. I think we've got an entire country of people who have PTSD, and we have to reckon with that.
Where I think we disagree, I don't think that mind that fixes the table can fix a psychological problem. I think it's like.
Yeah, I respectfully disagree. Some can't be fixed, but I think it's always worth a try. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
27 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls on the other side of this break. Stay with us.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Defying Hitler by Sebastian Haffner, a memoir. This is from chapter 17, about a little more than a third of the way into the book. At first, the revolution only gave the impression of being an historical event like any other, a matter for the press that might just possibly have some effect on the public mood. The Nazis celebrate January 30th as their day of revolution. They are wrong. There was no revolution on January 30th, 1933, just a change of government. Hitler became chancellor, by no means the Führer of the Nazi regime. The cabinet contained only 2 Nazis apart from him. He swore an oath of allegiance to the Weimar Constitution. The general opinion was that it was not the Nazis who had won, but the bourgeois parties of the right, who had captured, in quotes, the Nazis and held all the key positions in the government. In constitutional terms, events had taken a much more conventional, unrevolutionary course than most of what had happened during the previous 6 months. Outwardly also, the day had no revolutionary aspects, unless one considers a Nazi torchlight procession through Wilhelmstrasse or a minor gunfight in the suburbs that night as signs of a revolution. For most of us outsiders, the experience of January 30th, 1933 was that of reading the papers and the emotions we felt while we were doing so. The morning headline was, "Hitler called to president." That produced a certain nervous, impotent irritation. Hitler had been called to the president in August and November. He had been offered the vice chancellorship and then the chancellorship. Both times he had set impossible conditions, and both times there had been solemn declarations.
never again. Each time, never again had lasted exactly 3 months. Hitler's opponents in Germany at that time suffered from a compulsive urge to offer him everything he wanted, indefatigably, and at an even cheaper price, indeed to press it upon him. It's the same now with his opponents outside Germany. Again and again, this appeasement was formally renounced, and again it gaily reappeared at the crucial moment. Just so today. Then, as now, one's only hope was Hitler's own unreasonableness. Would it not sooner or later exhaust the patience of his opponents? Then, as now, it became apparent that their patience knew no bounds. At midday, the headline said, "Hitler makes impossible demands." We nodded, half reassured. It was only too credible. It would have gone against his nature to ask for less than too much. Perhaps the cup had once more passed from us. Hitler, the last defense against Hitler. At about 5 o'clock, the evening papers arrived. Cabinet of National Unity formed Hitler Reichschancellor. I don't know what the general reaction was. For about a minute, mine was completely correct. Icy horror. Certainly this had been a possibility for a long time. You had to reckon with it. Nevertheless, it was so bizarre, so incredible to read it now in black and white. Hitler Reichschancellor. For a moment, I physically sensed the man's odor of blood and filth, the nauseating approach of a man-eating animal, its foul, sharp claws in my face. Then I shook the sensation off, tried to smile, started to consider, and found many reasons for reassurance. That evening, I discussed the prospects of the new government with my father. We agreed it had a good chance of doing a lot of damage, but not much chance of surviving very long. A deeply reactionary government with Hitler as its mouthpiece. Apart from this, it did not really differ much from the two governments that had succeeded Bruning's. Even with the Nazis, it would not have a majority in the Reichstag. Of course, that could always be dissolved, but the government had a clear majority of the population against it, in particular the working class, which would probably go communist now that the Social Democrats had completely discredited themselves. One could prohibit the communists, but that would only make them more dangerous. In the meantime, the government would be likely to implement reactionary social and cultural measures with some anti-Semitic additions to please Hitler. That would not attract any of its opponents to its side. Foreign policy would probably be a matter of banging the table. There might be an attempt to rearm. That would automatically add the outside world to the 60% of the home population who were against the Hitler government. Besides, who were the people who had suddenly started voting Nazi in the last 3 years? Misguided ignoramuses, for the most part, victims of propaganda, a fluctuating mass that would fall apart at the first disappointment. No, all things considered, this government was not a cause for alarm. The only question was what would come after it. It was possible that they would drive the country to civil war. The communists were capable of going on the attack before a prohibition against them came into force. The next day, this turned out to be the general opinion of the intelligent press. It is curious how plausible an argument it is, even today, when we know what came next. How could things turn out so completely different? Perhaps it was just because we were all so certain that they could not do so, and relied on that with far too much confidence. So we neglected to consider that it might, if worse came to worse, be necessary to prevent the disaster from happening. Through the whole of February 1933, everything that happened remained a matter for the press. In other words, it took place in an arena that would lose all reality for 99% of the population the moment there were no newspapers. Admittedly, enough occurred in that arena. The Reichstag was dissolved, then in a flagrant breach of the Constitution, Hindenburg also dissolved the Prussian regional parliament. There were fast and furious changes of personnel in the civil service. The book defined Hitler.
Hey, if you like the rants that I open the show with every day, they're typically published over at hartmannreport.com. Check it out. So back in 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt became president, we were in the depths of the Great Depression. He raised the top income tax rate on billionaires from 25% to 90%. The ultra-rich were screaming, and here's what he had to say.
A number of my friends who belong in the very high upper bracket have suggested to me on several occasions of late that if I am re-elected president, they will have to move to some other nation because of high taxes here. Now, I will miss them very much.
He just took it right to them, right? Now, what came out of that was the world's largest and fastest growing and first major middle class. We can do this again. We just have to raise taxes on rich people. It's pretty straightforward. There's a whole article about it over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. And welcome back. 35 minutes past the hour. Johan in Los Angeles. Hey, Johan, what's on your mind today?
About the education, especially the public one. Continuation from last hour. It's almost like a slavery all over again when slave owners didn't want slaves to read because they're afraid they can become better and educated. And the GOP conservatives, and especially Trump said, I love student people. And then Marjorie Taylor Greene said, I don't want my staff to be educated.
Yeah.
So it's no secret.
You're right. You're right.
And all they want is and obedience, loyalty, and following orders.
Yeah, they want to reinvent neo-feudalism. A new version of feudalism. Where you've got the lords who own everything and control everything, and you've got the serfs. I think that's probably a closer analogy than chattel slavery, but they both fall into that same category of a highly stratified, rigidified society where you've got a small group of mostly wealthy white people at the very top and everybody else is at the bottom. And they keep it that way by keeping people ignorant.
Yeah, and then the woman who called last hour talked about history, and what I realized is that it's always going to be incomplete, no matter how much we study, because most human beings love to show the good but hide the bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always going to be incomplete.
Oh yeah, you're right, and that's I think probably the natural tendency to do that has something to do with the pushback on Black history, but mostly it's just I think for a lot of very wealthy conservatives, they're concerned that if America's children discover what white people did to Black people and discover it in a way that's gut level knowledge, that when they become adults, when those children become adults, they may do something about reparations, which might involve taxing rich white people. And that's why the GOP and the rich white people don't want Black history taught. I don't think it has anything to do with Black people. I think it has to do with, worrying that young white people who will grow up to be a large part of the power structure and who come from families that have wealth might someday say, this is wrong and we need to repair it. We need to right it. And that's something they absolutely do not want to have happen because it would raise their taxes. What do you think?
Not just the taxes, just to make them look bad, and they don't hide from anything that is bad and ugly and dark.
Yeah.
And they don't want to be shown that.
Yeah, I get your point. Johan, thank you. Good one. Thank you. Mark in Rosendale, New York. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, how you doing?
Good. What's up?
Wanted to make you aware of a new book called The Education Myth. Seemed to fit in great today. It's by a professor at the University of Wisconsin named John Shelton. The basic premise of which is that public education was originally designed to, teach citizens how to function in a democracy. But in the 60s, it started moving towards developing human capital. And, the idea of meritocracy and that education's purpose was economic equality, not, a functional democracy or, God forbid, social democracy.
That's interesting.
It's a really interesting book. I've heard an interview with John Shelton. He's a very smart guy, and I just thought you might want to know about that.
Interesting. I wrote a book called Thom Hartmann's Complete Guide to ADHD back, 15 years, maybe 20 years ago. And when I was researching that book, I got into Horace Mann really deeply. Horace Mann was, he was the guy who brought us public education in the United States in the 1880s. Right. And he traveled around the country trying to sell public education as a public good and as something that would enhance democracy, and nobody was buying it. And finally, he found a receptive audience in Boston, and he changed his sales pitch. Because Boston at that time was the largest Catholic-run city in America, or it wasn't so much Catholic-run, but there was a growing Catholic power structure. And the Catholics had their own schools, and education was a big deal for them. And so Horace Mann sold this to the Protestant power structure of the state of Massachusetts. At that time, in the 1880s and 1890s, Massachusetts's legislature had been taken over by a group called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, which was a secret society. They had a secret handshake, and their slogan when you met another person who was a member of this was, "I know nothing." And so if you look up the know-nothings,
right, the know-nothings.
They were called the know-nothings. But they actually knew a lot. And it was the Protestant power structure of Massachusetts that was very intimidated by the growing Catholic power in Boston. And Horace Mann's sales pitch to them was twofold. Number one, that public schools would be regimented and therefore would produce good workers for the factory and soldiers for the military. And number two, that by forcing the Catholic people in Boston to send their children to these public schools rather than to Catholic schools, you could break the back of Catholic political power. And which is a bizarre, thing, but that was his sales pitch in the 1890s, and Massachusetts bought it. They were the first state to have, state-supported at the state level as opposed to at the local level public schools.
I did not know that.
Yeah, public schools have a checkered history, shall we say.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is they should do both, Mark. They should be educating people about how to function in a democracy, and they should be giving people life skills, which I've been saying for years. I don't know why people, how is it that you can graduate from high school and not know how to balance a checkbook or diaper a baby? It seems to me like there's some basic stuff that should be taught, but we try to throw that back on the family. But, number one, you should understand democracy and you should understand how to be a good citizen. And number two, you should have life skills, for family and friends and work. And number three, you should have work skills. You should know how to read and write and math and all those kind of things. We can do all those things.
I think all of those things are about functioning in a democracy.
Yeah.
Every single one you've mentioned.
Absolutely. Excellent point. Mark, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. That was fascinating. Tom in Irvine, California. Hey, Tom, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Yes, it's not the Reagan revolution, it's the Reagan devolution.
Yeah, really.
If I may, it was funny you mentioned Eisenhower. C-SPAN 2 was just showing his farewell address.
Oh, really?
The Eisenhower, yeah.
Wow, the farewell address is where he talked about the rise of the military-industrial complex, and he ended it with a prayer, which was just brilliant.
Exactly, yeah, that was just on maybe about 15 minutes ago. And then, if I may, I have your Mount Rushmore of your Thom Hartmann callers. Can I give that to you?
Sure.
It's, I would say, Norma of Alabama, and Kenyatta in California, Morris in California, and Paul in Washington. I learn so much when they call.
Yeah, that is our Mount Rushmore. We've got some really good regular callers. Tom, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that. Great to hear from you. John in Santa Cruz, California. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hi, Thom Hartmann. I like calling you. You're interesting to listen to.
Well, thank you, I think.
The question I have is, someone called in and I missed part of what he was talking about, but I remember you saying that everyone needs computers and the internet to function in society.
Increasingly.
Yeah, but the question I have, do you understand, when I go on the internet for like an hour or over an hour, after I'm done, I get mentally and physically very, very ill. And there's this thing called EMF. And I've had people talk to me. There are some people that get really sick when they go on the internet.
You mean EMF, electromagnetic fields?
Do you understand any of this stuff, and do you believe in it? Because a lot of people
I do and I don't. Whenever you send electricity that has an alternating current through a wire, it's going to produce a field, an electric field around that wire. That's how transformers and motors and generators work. Electronic devices produce a small amount of electromagnetic radiation, and some actually are intended to radiate that radiation. For example, a Wi-Fi router. Wi-Fi is electromagnetic radiation, typically in the 700 megahertz band, roughly. There has been a debate for years and years about whether this stuff is dangerous. We know that people who, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, who were working in the field, in the radio field, had a higher rate of leukemia, for example, than people who didn't. And they thought it might be the result of exposure to EMF from the transmitting towers. There's still a debate about that all these years later. I remember that because I was licensed as a broadcast engineer in 1968, and I'm a ham radio operator now. And so, EMF is a big deal because that's what you do with it. But most of the research that I've seen and most of the evidence I've seen suggests that unless you've got really, really high levels of radiation and a really close point source, it's not a concern. Radiation decays very rapidly. It decays according to what's called the reciprocal of the square rule, which means every time you double the distance, the amount of radiation falls by basically tenfold. It becomes 1/10 for every doubling, and roughly. So the odds of your getting, a radiation poisoning, as it were. I mean, this is not even in the same category as the kind of radiation that like uranium produces. That's a whole different thing. Those are particles, often the alpha particles, and then you've got waves like X-rays and things that are ionizing radiation that actually can damage DNA. None of this lower frequency stuff, Wi-Fi's, computers, all these things, cell phones, are in the ionizing range, so they don't generally do damage to cells unless they're at really, really, really high levels. So I'm frankly not concerned about it. I do though think that people spending an hour on a computer, there's a level of concentration necessary for that. There's a level of focus that can be a struggle for some people. Some people are flipped out essentially by the content that they're encountering. But that would be the beginning and end, John, of my cautions. John, thanks for the call. I hope that answer was useful. I do. It's one of the few areas where I can claim some actual knowledge. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
Back with more of your calls in just a moment. Stay tuned. And welcome back. Tom in Morgantown, West Virginia. I was talking about your town this morning. What's up?
Hey, that's why I called, Tom. Thanks for taking the call. Wanted to give you a local perspective on what you were talking about earlier.
Sure. We're talking about the protests at the University of West Virginia.
That's right. So at a higher level, you were talking about the rights attack on public education.
Right.
So in our case, it is very much a neoliberal leader of our university who single-handedly caused this budget problem that's forcing us to reduce our workforce.
This is University President Gee?
Correct, right. So he's got a long, long history of being a neoliberal. In fact, he was profiled in, I think, Newsweek, probably in the 80s or 90s. Everywhere he's gone, first move is to privatize a lot of the workforce. So janitorial and food service, that's the first thing that goes. So he is definitely a neoliberal. And this ties very much to your caller about Chicago and Rahm Emanuel.
Right.
People who might otherwise be thought of as a Democrat, but following these neoliberal principles. So he's come here and he's done that, right? So he trims everything at the lower levels. He has quadrupled the number of associate vice presidents and vice presidents. He's bloated the top. And years ago, he had a stated goal of getting enrollment up to about 40,000. We're usually around 24,000 students. And we were headed in that direction. We kept going up and up and up. All of a sudden, it started to go down. Well, while he was making this assertion that we were going to get to 40,000 students, he was taking out bonds to build new dorms and all sorts of facilities, buy property in town, that sort of thing. Well, all of a sudden, enrollment started to go down, and it caused a real budget crisis. And it's all his own doing.
Because
he's not taking any responsibility for this at all.
He was imagining that growth would be greater than it turned out to be.
And no one really knows what that was based on, other than wishful thinking.
Yeah. Wow. So you've got a university that is suffering from maladministration. I noted that in this article that I shared with you from Truth Out, that there were several of the students who were interviewed were demanding that he resign. Is that demand for his resignation?
Real movement.
Yeah, is that catching fire?
Movement. In fact, the faculty senate is going to meet next week on a resolution for a vote of no confidence. This is the second attempt. They had a vote of no confidence months ago.
Right. Does he
This guy's been kind of run out of town multiple times at different universities.
I'm assuming this university has a board of regents or whatever they call their governing body. A board of directors.
Yeah, and they're all part of the same good old boy network. They support him to no end. Yeah.
Yeah. So, wow. Are there any logical candidates to replace him?
No, his administration would, it wouldn't be good to do an internal replacement if he were to go, because he's surrounded by his cronies.
Right, and he would get rid of those people before they could represent a threat, presumably. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Tom, thank you. I really appreciate the insider view. That was very interesting. Thank you. 51 minutes past the hour. Back with your calls in just a moment. I'll be back with you in 60 seconds. Stay with us. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. When I was a little kid, my grandmother had a piano, and I loved to play it. I was incompetent, but I was figuring out all kinds of stuff. And then I kind of got away from it and, went to school and things got busy and just lost track of it. Well, now there's this fascinating new study out of the University of Geneva, Switzerland, that is making me think maybe I should go back and learn the piano. What they found was that they took a group of 132 healthy older adults, retired, 62 to 78 years old. Half of them learned the piano, half of them took music classes without learning the piano. And what they found was that those who learned the piano actually had the strongest increase in their memory, in their mental competence, their mental faculties. Those who took the music classes also did well, but learning the piano was a huge step. So check it out. There's a whole long rant about this over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. Well, welcome back. Picking up your calls here. John in Boulder, Colorado. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I am an author, philosopher, and mathematician, and I have discovered a mathematically proven universal law that is the underlying principle of human health, equality, justice, democracy, and universal peace. And I realize that that's a bold claim.
Calling me skeptical, John. Go for it.
I understand, but the point is I've proven it with a mathematical proof.
Okay.
And a mathematical proof is not a matter of belief, it's a matter of fact. And in fact, there are some professors in physics, electrical engineering, who think it should be a Nobel Prize in physics and or
So what is your mathematical proof, John?
Well,
I feel like I'm being set up for something here.
Well, let's talk about the universal law that it proves, and that is that all systems function most efficiently without unnecessary resistance. And that's almost a tautology.
Yeah, it is.
But just about everything in the universe is a system, and maybe everything. Something might not be, but I don't know what it would be.
Yeah, I mean, water going downhill, everything looks for the path of least resistance.
Right, and just about everything in the universe is a system, right?
Right.
And so,
or could be viewed as one. Yeah.
Could be viewed as one, right? And so it's the underlying principle of democracy, justice, health. And because I've proven it with a mathematical proof, it is a universal law, and it's more immutable than empirically derived laws.
So what's the mathematical proof here, John? Give me your formula.
Well, the mathematical proof is simple. It's a proof by contradiction, and what the proof says is assume that there is some system that functions most efficiently with unnecessary resistance, but then it wouldn't be unnecessary. So you're assuming the opposite of what you're trying to prove and showing that results in a contradiction. All mathematicians understand the structure of the proof. Sure. It's simple. Okay. The question is, what are the implications? And so it is a universal law, and what it's really saying is that, laws, things that there are a lot of things that Republicans, for example, are saying that are going against this universal law.
So let me give you an example in my mind. For example, the idea of universal health care. Universal health care has been put into place in every other democracy in the world, in many cases by conservatives, right? I mean, Winston Churchill was a conservative, the National Health Service, because it's the least expensive way to do it. It has the least friction, essentially. It's the most efficient use of money. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about, John?
Partly, but let's talk about something like justice.
We have 15
democracy.
seconds here.
Okay, this is going to be a longer conversation, but justice is based on a mathematically proven universal law, and you can't go against a universal law and assume that you're going to have a good outcome. If I jump off the edge of a cliff and disregard the law of gravity, we know it's going to happen, and that's regardless of whether I believe in God or don't believe in God, or whether I'm a Democrat or a Republican.
Right. So justice, I mean, I think justice is a universal. In fact, justice is understood by animals. I mean, if you treat one animal unfairly in front of another animal, you will get a reaction. Fascinating stuff, John. Thank you very much for the call. I'd still like to see the formula. We're getting ready to write it down. But anyway, we'll continue. I have a crazy alert. A far-right lawmaker wants to defund. We talked about that, didn't we? Trump, Putin, and the meaning of the mafia state. That's up next. Stay with us.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Defying Hitler by Sebastian Haffner, a memoir. This is from chapter 17, about a little more than a third of the way into the book. At first, the revolution only gave the impression of being an historical event like any other, a matter for the press that might just possibly have some effect on the public mood. The Nazis celebrate January 30th as their day of revolution. They are wrong. There was no revolution on January 30th, 1933, just a change of government. Hitler became chancellor, by no means the Führer of the Nazi regime. The cabinet contained only 2 Nazis apart from him. He swore an oath of allegiance to the Weimar Constitution. The general opinion was that it was not the Nazis who had won, but the bourgeois parties of the right, who had captured, in quotes, the Nazis and held all the key positions in the government. In constitutional terms, events had taken a much more conventional, unrevolutionary course than most of what had happened during the previous 6 months. Outwardly also, the day had no revolutionary aspects, unless one considers a Nazi torchlight procession through Wilhelmstrasse or a minor gunfight in the suburbs that night as signs of a revolution. For most of us outsiders, the experience of January 30th, 1933 was that of reading the papers and the emotions we felt while we were doing so. The morning headline was, "Hitler called to president." That produced a certain nervous, impotent irritation. Hitler had been called to the president in August and November. He had been offered the vice-chancellorship and then the chancellorship. Both times he had set impossible conditions, and both times there had been solemn declarations, "Never again." Each time, "never again" had lasted exactly 3 months. Hitler's opponents in Germany at that time suffered from a compulsive urge to offer him everything he wanted, indefatigably, and at an even cheaper price. Indeed, to press it upon him. It's the same now with his opponents outside Germany. Again and again, this appeasement was formally renounced, and again it gaily reappeared at the crucial moment. Just so today. Then, as now, one's only hope was Hitler's own unreasonableness. Would it not sooner or later exhaust the patience of his opponents? Then, as now, it became apparent that their patience knew no bounds. At midday, the headline said, "Hitler makes impossible demands." We nodded, half reassured. It was only too credible. It would have gone against his nature to ask for less than too much. Perhaps the cup had once more passed from us. Hitler. At about 5 o'clock, the evening papers arrived. Cabinet of National Unity formed Hitler Reichschancellor. I don't know what the general reaction was. For about a minute, mine was completely correct. Icy horror. Certainly this had been a possibility for a long time. You had to reckon with it. Nevertheless, it was so bizarre, so incredible to read it now in black and white. Hitler, Reichschancellor. For a moment, I physically sensed the man's odor of blood and filth, the nauseating approach of a man-eating animal, its foul, sharp claws in my face. Then I shook the sensation off, tried to smile, started to consider, and found many reasons for reassurance. That evening, I discussed the prospects of the new government with my father. We agreed it had a good chance of doing a lot of damage, but not much chance of surviving very long. A deeply reactionary government with Hitler as its mouthpiece. Apart from this, it did not really differ much from the 2 governments that had succeeded Brüning's. Even with the Nazis, it would not have a majority in the Reichstag. Of course, that could always be dissolved, but the government had a clear majority of the population against it, in particular the working class, which would probably go communist now that the Social Democrats had completely discredited themselves. One could prohibit the communists, but that would only make them more dangerous. In the meantime, the government would be likely to implement reactionary social and cultural measures with some anti-Semitic additions to please Hitler. That would not attract any of its opponents to its side. Foreign policy would probably be a matter of banging the table. There might be an attempt to rearm. That would automatically add the outside world to the 60% of the home population who were against the Hitler government. Besides, who were the people who had suddenly started voting Nazi in the last 3 years? Misguided ignoramuses, for the most part, victims of propaganda, a fluctuating mass that would fall apart at the first disappointment. No, all things considered, this government was not a cause for alarm. The only question was what would come after it. It was possible that they would drive the country to civil war. The communists were capable of going on the attack before a prohibition against them came into force. The next day, this turned out to be the general opinion of the intelligent press. It is curious how plausible an argument it is, even today,
when we know what came next. How could things turn out so completely different? Perhaps it was just because we were all so certain that they could not do so and relied on that with far too much confidence. So we neglected to consider that it might, if worse came to worse, be necessary to prevent the disaster from happening. Through the whole of February 1933, everything that happened remained a matter for the press. In other words, it took place in an arena that would lose all reality for 99% of the population the moment there were no newspapers. Admittedly, enough occurred in that arena. The Reichstag was dissolved, then in a flagrant breach of the Constitution, Hindenburg also dissolved the Prussian regional parliament. There were fast and furious changes of personnel in the civil service. The book Defying Hitler.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome to the third hour of our program. The mafia state? Seriously? This is fascinating. A New York Supreme Court, state Supreme Court judge ruled yesterday against Donald Trump. Now, here's what had been going on. This is a report from the Daily Beast, by the way. Letitia James, the Attorney General for the state of New York, filed a lawsuit against the Trump organization and its senior executives, including Donald Trump, alleging it's a $250 million lawsuit, alleging basically $250 million worth of fraud, and saying that the, quote, real estate mogul and family members he made executives got away with minimal scrutiny. That's a phrase from the indictment, as it were, or the charges, or whatever you call them in these civil cases. And what they're basically charging him with is ripping off the government of New York State, saying that his properties, when he would go, let's say that he had a property worth $10 million. If he wants to get financing for it, he would go to the bank and say, my property's worth $30 million. And he'd get a $30 million loan. He'd pay off the $10 million and he'd live on the $20 million. If he had, when it came time to pay taxes on it, though, he'd go to the state and he'd say, well, my property's only worth $3 million. And so he'd only pay a very, very small amount of taxes on that $10 million property. And that he just did this his whole entire life, that his father did it before him. I mean, that's not part of the charges, but that certainly is part of the historical record. This goes back to that New York Times piece from 2017, I think it was, or 2018, when the New York Times got a hold of some of Donald Trump's tax records and found that he had, in fact, been lying about the value of his properties, both to the banks and to the state of New York. This is not new stuff. This is stuff that, you know, people in New York have known forever, and that the rest of us have known for, 6 years now, 7 years? So he's 34 days out. Well, actually, I think it's 32. He's about a month out now from his civil trial in New York, where his finances are going to be put under a microscope. And what Trump has been arguing in court is that the companies that have this information, that know the actual value of his properties, and that also know how much he's gotten from his loans, and also know how much he's paid in his taxes. This is principally like his bookkeepers, his CPA firms, his banks, his investment houses. They, you know, all of these agencies, that they cannot legally release that information to the state of New York, because the state of New York will make it public, and it's supposed to be proprietary. What they have claimed is that these documents, quote, contain highly sensitive, non-public, proprietary information. In this case, about one of his insurance providers, is Zurich Insurance. So Trump, you know, when Letitia James said, okay, we're going to prosecute you and we need these documents, and these organizations said, no, we're not going to give you the documents because Trump instructed us not to, and we work for him, not for you, she sued. she said, no, you have to give me the stuff. And they were like, no, we don't. And so it went to the state Supreme Court, the state of New York Supreme Court. And yesterday, Tuesday, the state Supreme Court ruled you can't hide that stuff. If Donald Trump was committing crimes here in the state of New York, you have to release those documents. Now, there wasn't a time, to the best of my knowledge, I haven't read the ruling. I've just read the news stories about the ruling, but I haven't seen in any of them that there was any specific time period in which the Trump Organization or Zurich Insurance or his bookkeepers or any other organization that he was working with has to reveal this information. I don't see it. So, so I can't say, tomorrow we're going to find out, or this afternoon we're going to find out. But it's going to come. Whether it's going to be released in a month in open court when the trial begins, assuming that the trial begins when it's scheduled to begin, or whether it's going to be something that is released to the general public before then, via the courts, or whether any of these companies or agencies even decide to just put it out there, or whether Donald Trump himself is going to release it. I mean, he's been known to do that with things that in some cases weren't in his own best interest, just trying to grab the news cycle that particular day. No idea which of those is going to be the scenario, but keep an eye on this. So this is going to get interesting because basically, and what they're saying is, or what Letitia James is saying, is that these are strategies that the mafia uses. That Trump is acting like a mob boss. And, frankly, that makes perfect sense. He was mobbed up. I mean, the Trump Tower was built with concrete from a mob-based company. Why? Well, his lawyer, Roy Cohn, was also the lead lawyer for the it was a Bonanno family? It wasn't that. It was a crime family that started with an S, as I recall. But in any case, he was Roy Cohn was the lawyer, the consigliere for New York's largest mafia family, and for Donald Trump. And he was Donald Trump's mentor. So surprise, surprise, Donald Trump is acting like a mafia character, and tried to run our government as if it was the mafia. Speaking of Donald Trump, he was on Glenn Beck's show yesterday. And Glenn Beck, this is just, it's kind of like an uh-oh alert. Uh-oh. Trump goes on Beck's show, and Beck says to him, in 2016 you said lock her up. And then when you became president, you said, we don't do that in America. That's just not the right thing to do. And Trump is like, yeah. So Beck says, do you regret not locking her up? And if you're president again, will you lock people up? And Trump says, there's no choice. The answer is you have no choice because of what they're doing to us. Lock them up. Donald Trump just told a hate radio talk show host that if he becomes president, he's going to start imprisoning people. Not investigating, not, prosecuting, imprisoning. This is Putin. This is Viktor Orban in Hungary. This is dictator stuff. This is what El-Sisi does in Egypt. This is what Erdogan does in Turkey. This is what Marcos does in the Philippines. I mean, this is what Bolsonaro did in Brazil. This is what fascists do. Oh, yeah. But, we're going to intentionally go out and lock up our political competition. Now, Trump is saying that the reason why he's justified in doing this is because the Biden administration is prosecuting him. Well, it's not the Biden administration, it's the Department of Justice, which outlasts any single administration. In fact, several of the prosecutors who are going after him are Republicans. But that said, they're not going after him because he's the political opponent of the Democrats. They're going after him because he's a crook. That's what the Justice Department does. They go after criminals. And Donald Trump, to my mind, now he hasn't been adjudicated a criminal yet. He has been adjudicated a rapist, so I guess that makes him a criminal, but that was in civil court. It was not a criminal proceeding. But he's on the edge of being adjudicated as a criminal. And that's what the criminal justice system does, is it brings justice on behalf of the victims to criminals. So anyway, we'll see where this goes. Keep your eye on this thing. It's interesting times we live in, shall we say. The hurricane now is largely past Florida, is whacking Georgia and heading for South Carolina. It has been downgraded to a Category 1 hurricane, but that's still insanely destructive. And this is a path that is very rarely traveled by hurricanes. We are seeing global warming play out right in front of our eyes.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
15 minutes past the hour, back with your calls on the other side of this break. And welcome back. Patrick in Marietta, Georgia. Hey, Patrick, what's on your mind today?
Hi there. A recurrent economic theme that you discuss in some callers regarding, in essence, of the 50s, the post-World War II era, and something that seems to be forgotten by all is that the U.S. had no industrial competition post-World War II. So, and post-World War II, you had the end of colonialism. So those countries were able to get fairer prices for their resources, OPEC being the prime example. And so to a certain extent, the decline of the middle class, those two factors were important, as well as all the other factors you generally mention. And I just wanted to put that reminder out there. But those were huge forces.
Yeah, they were not inconsequential. However, that said, right now, and Paul Krugman had these numbers in his column yesterday, and so I'm running from memory here. Forgive me if I have them wrong. I refer you to Paul Krugman in the New York Times. But in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, during that period of time that you're talking about, our participation in international trade was a relatively small part of our GDP. My recollection is he said it was around 6 or 7%. Now it's in the neighborhood of 20 to 30%. Because, walk into a Walmart, when Sam Walton started Walmart in the 1980s, I remember when he opened one in Georgia. We were living in Atlanta at the time, and it was the first Walmart near Atlanta. And it had this giant cloth banner that was probably 60 feet long and 20 feet tall that said 100% made in the USA. Now, if you walk into a Walmart, it's 100% made in overseas. So while it is true that we didn't have a lot of industrial competition, we were helping build that competition. The Marshall Plan, for example, that rebuilt Europe, we did not do with Europe what China's doing, for example, with their Belt and Road Initiative. We didn't send American companies to Germany to make cement and steel. We gave Germany money for them to rebuild their own companies. And by the mid-1950s, most of Germany and much of Japan was rebuilt. Japan was not largely, you had 3 cities in Japan that were badly damaged by World War II, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. But the rest of Japan, the industrial infrastructure of Japan, was really not that badly harmed. I remember when I was a kid in the 1950s, that some Japanese stuff was making its way into the United States, and my dad telling me that they had renamed a city in Japan USA, so that they could stamp "Made in USA" on products that were being sold in the United States. I don't know if that's a vanishing hitchhiker story or not, but I remember it quite vividly. And so yes, you're right, and it was a factor, but it was not a big factor. The big factor was that a third of America was unionized. We're down now to 6% in the private workforce. That and that established the wage floor for the other third of America. So you had 2/3 of America that had a good union job. You could establish a middle-class lifestyle with a single paycheck. Today it requires 2 paychecks. And we're down to 43% of us are in the middle class, where it was a 60, 65, 66% when Reagan came into office. So your point is well taken, Patrick, and Republicans love to make that point, to say, it wasn't FDR, it wasn't even Eisenhower, it was this. But that was really not the biggest factor. The biggest factor was that America had a strong industrial sector, a really strong industrial sector. And there was an enormous rebound in demand after World War II because of all the rationing. I got to run. Patrick, thanks for the call. We'll be right back, 20 minutes past the hour. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. The MAGA Republicans have a plan for America. It involves something called fascism. It's a three-step plan, actually, to take over America and turn us into a fascist state. They're following the example of Vladimir Putin in Russia and Viktor Orban in Hungary. Viktor Orban, who is held up by conservatives as the example of how a country should be run. He came to Texas to give a speech to CPAC and got a standing ovation. So the three steps. Number one, take over the electoral systems and basically rig them, along with massive gerrymandering. Number two, build a fascist base by mobilizing hate against minorities, gender minorities, racial minorities, religious minorities, while merging with one of the large factions of a church. And the billionaires in the country. And number three, seize control of state power and turn the criminal justice system against your enemies. There's an op-ed about the whole thing over at HartmannReport.com. It's titled, Revealed, the MAGA Republicans' Three-Step Plan for Classic Fascism. Check it out. 21 minutes past the hour. Let's pick up your calls here. Gary in Edwardsville, Illinois. Hey, Gary, what's on your mind today?
Oh, great, Tom. You led right into me with that fascist thing in your book. But I think fascism is the biggest menace to the United States of America, and I would like to come up with a definition. I'd really like to dumb it down. Fascism is basically rule by big money.
Yeah, in the 80s, the American Heritage Dictionary said fascism is the merger of corporate and state interests combined with belligerent nationalism.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but the rule by big money. So the Republican Party is the fascist party, and I hate to say it, but I think this country is rapidly turning fascism because of Republicans. But the goal is get rid of all government functions.
Right.
In other words, strip out the government, defund it every chance you get. Any government agency, either strip it out or defund it, replace it by big corporations and billionaires.
Yep.
And they will run everything.
Yep.
And if there is a dictator that takes over, he will milk these billionaires and the corporations, for himself, but he will promote fascism. And
which is exactly what Hitler did, what Mussolini did, what Putin did, what Orban is doing, and frankly, I would say what Donald Trump tried to do.
Yeah, so you promote fascism with taxes. You keep the rich at all costs from being taxed. You give tax breaks to the rich. Then you come up with this trickle down nonsense where it just magically, you give it all to the billionaires and it magically trickles down to the rest of us.
Yep.
And you con people on this and people believe this nonsense.
Yep.
But
I agree. I think you've said it in a bite-sized, digestible form, Gary, and spot on. Thank you very much for adding that to our conversation. Cody in New York City. Hey, Cody, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I wanted to offer my 2 cents on what I think is going on with the Heritage Foundation project. It's Project 2025. Mm-hmm. So I think what's happening here is that the billionaires, the wealthiest 1%, are seeking to replicate the success that they have had with the Federalist Society and appointing judges. So under this program, this diabolical blueprint, what they've done is we now have billionaires who are appointing Supreme Court justices. Right? This is crazy. It's insane. I mean, it undermines democracy. So how have they been able to do this? And here is the diabolical blueprint. Here's how they do it. So they use a private organization, the Federalist Society. So it's not government. It's a private organization. Then they hire people, the billionaires hire employees to develop lists of candidates who can be appointed judges, and they make sure that these candidates will rule in favor of the billionaires.
Right.
Then the billionaires, when they fund political candidates, they basically extort these political candidates. They go to the political candidates, these right-wing political candidates, and they say, we will fund your campaign, but only if you appoint judges from this list.
Right.
So if you see through the end result of this, what is happening is that the billionaires are appointing Supreme Court justices and other judges as well.
Right.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So the billionaires have thought to themselves, you know what? We've had such wild success with this, success beyond our wildest imagination, that we now want to do the same thing in infiltrating government and making appointments all throughout the federal government, throughout the Department of Education, throughout the FDA, throughout the regulators. And the way they're going to do this is they're going to follow the same diabolical blueprint.
Right. The Heritage Foundation has already come up with a list of, 40,000 people? That they are proposing for all these different federal agencies, that a Republican president can just take these 40,000 people and drop them in and just hit the ground running. It took Donald Trump 3 years to get most of his federal agencies staffed because he just was not prepared to become president. He wasn't expecting to win.
Yeah, exactly right. So what the net result of that is what you have billionaires, the richest 1%, controlling government, appointing all these people to government. So not only now are they appointing judges, they are now going to be appointing officials all throughout government.
Yeah, it's the oligarchs running the country. This is the model that Viktor Orban is doing in Hungary. It's what Vladimir Putin is doing in Russia. Theoretically democratically elected presidents, and it's been a long time policy for countries like Turkey and whatnot, Egypt, but yes, they're talking about institutionalizing this rather than doing it on a kind of ad hoc basis. Being prepared.
Exactly.
They are absolutely ready for the next GOP president. Yeah, excellent point,
exactly.
Cody. Thanks a lot for the call.
Keep ringing the bell.
Yeah, you got it. Good talking to you. We'll be right back, 27 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Stay tuned.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Speaking the truth, the Heritage really rather you didn't know all about. I'll be right back with you. For the Thom Hartmann Book Club today, it's Waking the Witch, Reflections on Women, Magic, and Power by Pam Grossman. This is from the introduction. Witches have always walked among us, populating societies and storyscapes across the globe for thousands of years. From Circe to Hermione, from Morgan Le Fay to Marie Laveau, the witch has long existed in the tales we tell about ladies with strange powers who can harm or heal. And although people of all genders have been considered witches, it's a word that is now usually associated with women. Throughout most of history, she has someone to fear, an uncanny other who threatens our safety or manipulates reality for her own mercurial purposes. She's a pariah, a persona non grata, a boogie woman to defeat and discard. Although she's often been deemed a destructive entity, in actuality, a witchy woman has historically been far more susceptible to attack than an inflictor of violence herself. As with other terrifying outsiders, she occupies a paradoxical role in cultural consciousness as both vicious aggressor and vulnerable prey. Over the past 150 years or so, however, the witch has done another magic trick by turning from a fright into a figure of inspiration. She is now as likely to be the heroine of your favorite TV show as she is its villain. She might show up in the form of your Wiccan co-worker or the beloved musician who gives off a sorceress vibe in videos or on stage. There's also a chance that she is you, and that witch is an identity you've taken upon yourself for any number of reasons, heartfelt or flippant,
public or private. Today, more women than ever are choosing the way of the witch, whether literally or symbolically. They're floating down catwalks and sidewalks in gauzy black clothing and adorning themselves with Pinterest-worthy pentagrams and crystals. They're filling up movie theaters to watch witchy films and gathering in back rooms and backyards to do rituals, consult tarot cards, and set life-altering intentions. They're marching in the streets with Hex the Patriarchy placards and casting spells each month to try to constrain the commander-in-chief. Year after year, articles keep proclaiming it's the season of the witch, as journalists try to wrap their heads around the mushrooming witch trend. And all of this begs the question, why? Why do witches matter? Why are they seemingly everywhere right now? What exactly are they? And why the hell won't they go away? I get asked such things over and over, and you would think that after a lifetime of studying and writing about witches, as well as hosting a witch-themed podcast and being a practitioner of witchcraft myself, my answers would be succinct. In fact, I find that the more I work with the witch, the more complex she becomes. Hers is a slippery spirit. Try to pin her down, and she'll only recede further into the dark, deep wood. I do know this for sure, though. Show me your witches, and I'll show you your feelings about women. The fact that the resurgence of feminism and the popularity of the witch are ascending at the same time is no coincidence. The two are reflections of each other. That said, this current witch wave is nothing new. I was a teen in the 1990s, the decade that brought us such pop culture as Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Charmed, and The Craft. Not to mention Riot Girls and third-wave feminists who taught me that female power could come in a variety of colors and sexualities. I learned that women could lead a revolution while wearing lipstick and combat boots, and sometimes even a cloak. But my own witchly awakening came at an even earlier age. Morganville, New Jersey, where I was raised, was a solidly suburban town, but it retained enough natural land features back then to still feel a little bit scruffy in spots. We had a small patch of woods in our backyard that abutted a horse farm, and the two were separated by a wisp of running water that we could cross via a plank of wood. When we were little, my older sister Emily and I would sometimes venture to the other side where we could feed the horses, an act that still scares me to this day, and pick fistfuls of clover. But the majority of our time was spent on our side of the stream, threading ourselves through the thicket of trees that served as our personal forest. In one corner of the yard, a giant puddle would form whenever it rained, surrounded by a border of ferns. We called this spot our magical place. That it would vanish and then reappear only added to its mystery. It was a portal to the unknown. These woods are where I first remember doing magic, entering that state of deep play where imaginative action becomes reality. I would spend hours out there creating rituals with rocks and sticks, drawing secret symbols in the dirt, losing all track of time. It was a space that felt holy and wild, yet still strangely safe. As we age, we're supposed to stop filling our heads with such nonsense. Unicorns are to be traded in for Barbie dolls, though both are mythical creatures to be sure. We lose our tooth fairies, walk away from our wizards. Dragons get slain on the altar of our youth. Most kids grow out of their magic phase. I grew further into mine. My grandma Trudy was a librarian at the West Long Branch Library, which meant I got to spend many a long afternoon lurking between the 001.9 and 135 Dewey Decimal sections, reading about Bigfoot and dream interpretation and Nostradamus. Waking the Witch by Pam Grossman.
From international trade policy to immigration policy to housing, we've got all kinds of topics. The wars between Republicans and Democrats, the Republican efforts to induce fascism in the United States. A great selection of opinions will be found over at HartmannReport.com. Back in 2010, when Viktor Orban took over the Fidesz party in Hungary, that party was sort of like the Republican Party. It was just a conventional, conservative European political party. And he has turned it into a neo-fascist powerhouse. He pushed through he altered the nation's constitution to push through what we would call gerrymandering and voter suppression so that his party will always win. He campaigned on building a wall. Build a wall was literally one of his campaign slogans, and he did build a wall across the southern border of Hungary to keep out Syrian refugees who were fleeing the violence when Russia was bombing that country. His other two campaign slogans were, and I quote, "Restore Christian purity and make Hungary great again." Seriously, back in 2010, 6 years before Trump. There's an amazing backstory about how Viktor Orban is being cloned, essentially, in the GOP. You can find the article over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. 35 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls. Tom in Boston. Hey, Tom, what's on your mind today? Thanks for listening to WHMP.
Thank you for such a great show. Tom, you had somebody about electrical fields a little earlier, and I just wanted to throw my 2 cents in. I heard you. I think what I wanted to illuminate a little bit was biologicals. I always brought up reading, watts per centimeter square as a measurement. So I think when you get into, cells and you talk about alternating current, you hit a point where they warm. Now, like you say, a microwave is tuned, say, to the water molecule. These frequencies aren't so far off. They heat water.
Your microwave frequencies are in the 2 gigahertz range.
Yeah.
Some of your cell, what is it called? Number 5.
5G, you mean?
Yeah, 5G. Thank you very much. 5G is, can use 2 gigahertz. It uses that. It uses the 1 gigahertz, and it uses the old 700 megahertz. But in order to get any warming of a biological material, you would have to have a really, really high level of watts per square meter, or watts per square anything. I mean, the kind of wattage that comes out of your phone is not capable of doing that.
Well, to your point,
I think
earlier,
the old ones might have. I always thought that Ted Kennedy might have gotten brain cancer from using one of those brick phones because they were blowing out really, really high levels of radiation. But nowadays,
I missed that line. I used to see him on the shuttle. So what I'm getting at is, I had a bag phone originally when they first came out. I was trying to start my little electrical business. And, I put an antenna. It was a 3-watt. And, the people that were experimenting on those original, the engineers, I think more, I forget the particulars, but, there was some brain tumor problems and a few of them died. But, they've studied a lot. They're a lot more tuned in. But I'll tell you, I just got a phone the other day because I got a 4G. I use your 4G. It's perfect. I'm a little afraid. My sister worked for CBS for years, and she got some preferred stock when they had some troubles, and she had a U.S. tower, American tower, I guess. And I can remember talking to her about it. I said, we got to put these little things with less power on top of the telephone poles. But I never dreamed to get an increased bandwidth that they'd go to 5G.
Well, 5G is just a different. It's just a different codec.
Frequency.
No, it's not different frequency. They're all using even LTE. I'm not sure if LTE is using the top end of the band, but it's not. It's not so much frequency. It's a different encoding and decoding system for digital data. It's a more efficient algorithm, essentially. It's got,
Yeah, you're probably right. I haven't really paid attention. I just know the bandwidth.
I am right.
There's so much more information.
Yeah,
so
I'm on the board of a nonprofit that owns a lot of bandwidth, or leases a lot of bandwidth here in Oregon, and we lease it to T-Mobile, and we use the revenue from that to support progressive causes. So I'm real familiar with it, or relatively familiar with this. But what's your point, Tom?
The point is you have to think about this not just like the physicist. You have to think about it like the doctor. And I do think that when you're talking about something coming off your ear, that's point location to your point, and the heating effect on a biological is something. And I've seen some reasonably good science that said, there's some shriveling ends of nerves and things. So I'm very leery. I believe in these little earbuds.
I don't think, right up front, I don't think that there's enough juice there to cause any biological effect. That said, whenever possible, I use my phone on speaker rather than, right up against my head. So let's just leave it at that.
I don't know if you have any time, but you had one other thing a while back. I didn't call it about electrical. I think it was about grounded systems or something, and that's my forte, electrical. And I don't know if I'm on the right point or not, but when you have an alternating current or a transformer, it's ungrounded. So electrical systems per our code are required to be grounded. So what we do is we decide, okay, this end of the coil is going to earth, and that is physically brought to earth. And generally on a good systems we have in cities, it's all grounded together in a unified way, which will hopefully lower the spikes from lightning or whatever. So what that does is it allows us to, on the other side, put a fuse. And by doing that, on the ungrounded side, when the fuse blows, everything goes down to earth and dead. And the hot stuff is only back there.
Yeah. Tom, we are wandering into territory that is just completely lost everybody who's listening. Michael in Monterey, California. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Can you hear me?
I can. What's up?
Yeah, well, Tom, I told your screener that I am a retired police officer. I'm a retired police officer from a major metropolitan city in California. And I called because of what didn't occur and what possibly could occur in the future. What I'm referring to is January 6th. Police officers are governed by posts. In California, and I think in other states, police officer standards and training. And the use of deadly force is authorized under certain situations in city, counties, and states. And I don't know how it applies. I'm sorry, do you hear me?
I do.
I didn't hear you.
I do hear you. I'm not sure what you're trying to say, though, Michael. I don't understand.
What I'm trying to say is, when January 6th occurred, one thing that stuck out in my mind, the non-use of deadly force. Right. If it was applicable,
it was used. Actually, the deadly force was used once against Ashley Babbitt.
Right. That's what I'm referring to. Who gave the order to stand down? And they say Nancy Pelosi and the Sergeant of Arms gave that word.
No.
But also when Donald Trump
there was no order to stand down. There was no order getting through to those guys at all. I mean, they were on their own. Chris Miller, the acting Secretary of Defense, had written a memo 3 days earlier, specifically telling the National Guard, excuse me, you may not help these people. You may not do anything for these people. They're on their own. They saw this coming. Chris Miller and the FBI, Chris Wray, these guys knew what was coming. They knew what was going to happen on January 6th, in my opinion. And frankly, I think because they were all Trump appointees, they wanted it to happen. Right. I don't see any evidence, and I've not heard any, and there was none in the January 6th, that there were any kind of stand-down orders, and I'm just going to leave it at that. Sarah in Fort Worth, Texas. Hey, Sarah, what's on your mind today?
I'd like to go back to the Metropolis movie topic. And as we were talking, before I start, I would like to say, one, I feel that we're moving into the same direction where Donald Trump is controlling the media, and I feel that that's how he got elected the first time. Anyway, back to the subject. There's a movie. A lot of people are familiar. It's a children's movie, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
I never saw it.
Well, it's about a flying car, but they Dick Van Dyke, and it's set in the 1910s, 20s, that type of thing. And he creates this flying car that goes to a kingdom where all of the children are outlawed and they have to live underground.
Oh, interesting.
And all of the
So apparently this was a big deal metaphor in the 1910s, 1920s.
Yeah, evidently. But yet, as I was on hold, I thought about the grandfather. He's got some sense of dementia, and he only goes back to World War I. So
interesting. Yeah. Well, thank you, Sarah. Thanks for adding that to the conversation. It's 44 minutes past the hour. I'm picking up your calls. I'll be right back. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Fair and only slightly unbalanced. I'll be right back with your calls right after this. And welcome back. Rudy in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, Rudy, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, you had a caller that really got my attention. Guy John was saying that everything is mathematical. And I believe that life has laws and mankind has nothing to do with it. He tends to go against these particular laws. And I'm like you. I was waiting on this guy to give the equation, and I'm far from a math guy. I was a BC student, but
I was ready to write it down.
Yes. I do understand that 1 and 1 will always be 2, and that every action, there's an opposite or equal reaction. These are the things that will never change.
Right.
And I remember sitting in my chemistry class. I probably wasn't paying attention, but I remember my teacher had this picture up of the Earth, and it had a plus on one side and a negative on the other. And she, basically she was saying, to the kids that, hey, you have a choice of being a positive, negative. But that being said, life does have laws, and mankind, whether it's politics or religion, he's always going to throw his turd in to try to bend that to 3. Try to bend that 1 + 1 = 2. He's going to try to make it 3.
Yeah.
He's always tried to do that. And, I came from a, Christian background. But as I got older, Tom, I do believe that everything is about numbers. It always comes back to the numbers. You just cannot keep slapping someone or a situation upside the head and don't think that there's not going to be a record of that.
Yeah.
Whether it's the earth, humanity, or whatever, there is an arrhythmic.
Newton's laws apply to humanity as well as to inanimate objects, in other words.
Right. And I just think that right now we're living in a time where there are a lot of things that are just coming to a head because the numbers just don't add up.
Yeah.
I don't care whether these guys, who these billionaires or people that's supposed to be running this earth, but we've given these people the weapons, the tools to actually kill us. And I really do believe that Mother Nature will have a say-so way before we do anything legislatively.
Oh, look what happened in Florida this morning, Rudy.
Right. And I hope that this guy Jump calls back sometime in the near future and drop that equation because it is about the numbers, Tom. Yeah. You just can't keep doing something and thinking you're going to get another outcome.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm with you, Rudy. I think that there are some immutable principles, laws, whatever you want to call them. When you do A or when you mix A and B, you get C. When as you said, 1 and 1 is 2. Then we get people coming along, con men, basically, the Trumps of the world saying, no, that's not the way it works. And then they try to BS us. They say, well, if you give if you raise people's minimum wage, it's going to throw them into poverty. And it's like, wait a minute, that makes no sense. But that's literally an argument that Republicans make. It's crazy, but Rudy, I got to run. But thank you for the call. It's 48 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back with more of your calls. Stay tuned. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio, and tag you're it. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, picking up your calls. And Jim in Pioneer, Ohio. Hey, Jim, what's on your mind today?
Hi. I thought I'd continue the conversation again. A while back, I was watching C-SPAN. There was a congressional hearing with Jeff Sessions when he was Attorney General under Donald Trump.
Right.
There was a congressman that had a bunch of examples involving Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation a couple times, I think, even Bill. And each one of these examples ended with, well, and this sounds like, or this looks like.
Right. But there was never actually any evidence of any wrongdoing.
Well, when he was done with his examples, he said, in light of all this evidence, why haven't you indicted Hillary Clinton? And Attorney General Jeff Sessions said, well, what it sounds like or what it looks like isn't good enough.
Right.
We need facts.
Yep.
All he needed was facts.
Yep. And they didn't have them.
And that Donald Trump
right. And it's
whining about.
No, I get it, Jim. And this is the same problem the Republicans have right now. This is what Jim Jordan is struggling with. This is what James Comer is struggling with, on the judiciary and the oversight committees, trying to say the Biden crime family and, Hunter this and Hunter that. They have no facts. They have, what they've got is stuff that they can twist around and make it seem like innuendo, which is what the Republicans have been doing for years and years and years. And it's really tragic. Jim, thanks for the call. Evan in Austin, Texas. Hey, Evan, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, hi. Good afternoon. I'll get to what I was calling about in just a second, but I don't believe anyone said that raising minimum wage would throw people into poverty. I don't think that was the counter argument or
no, it absolutely is. I've had conservatives on this program argue that. Here's their logic. They say if you raise the minimum wage, what you're going to do is you're going to force businesses to have fewer people doing the same work with fewer people, which means that you're going to have a number of people who were working now unemployed, which means that they're going to be in poverty.
Okay, well, let me give you my conservative viewpoint about that. You artificially inflate the price of goods, making it harder for some people to afford them. Secondly, you put a strain on small business owners who are operating on very small margins. And lastly, you disincentivize people from trying to progress or educate themselves into higher earning positions. That's my position on it.
Okay, let me take those. Hang on just a second. And your third position was the ability to rise through the ranks, essentially. Number one, if labor was the only thing in the price of a product, then yeah, if you increase the price of labor, you're going to see the price of the product going up. So if, when minimum wage raises the price of, somebody mowing your lawn, yes, you're going to see slight, but for most manufactured goods, labor is actually a fairly small percentage of the product. And for most products that people buy in the United States, the labor cost is, it's a fraction. It's less than 10%. In some cases, it's less than 5%. Number one. Number two, if you've got a corporation that's very profitable, I let you do your riff. Let me finish mine. If you've got a corporation that's profitable, they've got money left over at the end of the year. What you're saying essentially is, your cost of labor is going to go up. You're going to have to pay for that out of profits. Because it's a competitive marketplace. Companies are competing with each other. They're not going to raise their prices because of competition. That's assuming you have competition. So I would say, number one, your assumption is flawed. And number two, with regard to the business model, you're saying you're going to have some small businesses or businesses, and whenever Republicans are saying, oh, we can't have a minimum wage go up, they always try to use the canard of small businesses. Most small businesses pay well above the minimum wage. Most of your minimum wage employees in the United States are employed by huge multi-billion-dollar corporations that are spinning off billions, in some cases tens of billions of dollars in profits. So basically, what I would say to them is if you've got a business model where you can't run your business successfully without exploiting people and paying crap wages that people can't live on, you should not have a business model that should exist in a country that, as rich as the United States. That is a belief that is shared. It's a consensus right across most of the developed world. Is why, you know, you've got a minimum wage in Denmark of functionally of $18 an hour. People make $18 an hour starting at McDonald's in Denmark. It doesn't mean that their burgers are more expensive. Their burgers are less than 3% more expensive than ours are. And finally, you said people can't rise through the ranks if they can't come in on the minimum wage. Again, that's nonsense. People can rise through the ranks no matter where they're hired on the financial spectrum.
No, I said it's a disincentive for them to educate themselves and try to progress.
Because they're making a good wage?
Promotions.
In other words, like my dad could raise a family working in a tool and die shop, therefore he didn't have an incentive to go to college and get a PhD?
Tom, we'll agree to disagree, but just two quick counterpoints again. One, labor is typically the highest variable cost for small business owners, and I think you should know that. And secondly, we're not talking about large multinational corporations. We're talking about Jim Smith, who operates a hamburger stand.
Then let me ask you a question here, Evan. Why is it that when Seattle raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour, and the minimum wage in Mississippi is still $7.25 an hour, why is it that when Seattle raised their minimum wage, they didn't see a bunch of small businesses go out of business? And why is it that you've got a bunch of small businesses in Mississippi that are hanging on by their teeth? My answer to that question, I'll let you answer it in just a second. My answer to that question is because in Seattle, when you give people a $15 minimum wage, they now have enough money to buy things. Buying things stimulates the economy and gives more business to those small businesses. That's not happening in Mississippi. Back to you.
Who works in Seattle and who works in Mississippi? You've got a bunch
We're talking minimum wage workers in both cases.
You've got a bunch of high-tech, high-paid
I am talking about people working at the burger stand, people mowing lawns, people working construction jobs, minimum wage workers in Seattle are making $15 an hour. Minimum wage workers in Mississippi are making $7 an hour. Seattle has a vibrant economy. Mississippi's economy sucks. It's because people aren't making enough money to spend money into the economy. When you raise the minimum wage, everybody benefits from it. Evan, I'm sorry, we're out of time. I got to run, but you know we'll live to fight another day. I look forward to a future phone call from you. Thanks so much for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. Have a great afternoon. Be good to yourself and the people around you. And we'll catch up with you tomorrow morning. Have a good one.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the HartmannReport.com website. That's also a daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox, no ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.